Well, good afternoon and welcome to BBC News live from Downing Street. 7 weeks after losing to Liz Truss in this year's first Tory leadership contest, Rishi Sunak has emerged as victor in this one. He is set to become the UK's next Prime Minister tomorrow, the first from a British Asian background. He'll take office as the country faces enormous economic challenges. The ex-Chancellor, who is addressing Conservative MPs in private around now, gained the support of more than half of Conservative MPs, with his rival Penny Mordaunt struggling to reach the threshold needed to go forward in the contest of 100 nominations. Here's the moment the announcement was made by Sir Graham Brady, who chairs the committee running the leadership contest.
Good afternoon. As returning officer in the leadership election, I can confirm that we have received one valid nomination. And Rishi Sunak is therefore elected as leader of the Conservative Party.
Moment the result was announced. Let's take a look then at our next Prime Minister. The former Chancellor Rishi Sunak had been the favourite to succeed his old boss Boris Johnson as Prime Minister after his resignation in July, but he failed to persuade Tory party members, who ultimately put Liz Truss in Downing Street in September. Rishi Sunak, who has not commented on the recent turmoil, said he was standing as Prime Minister to fix a profound economic crisis, as well as to unite his party. He became Chancellor in February 2020 and within weeks found himself having to steer the UK economy as the pandemic and its lockdowns began. In April, the finances of Rishi Sunak and his family came under intense scrutiny, with the tax affairs of his heiress wife, Akshata Murthy, placed in the spotlight. She later announced she would start paying UK tax on her overseas earnings to relieve political pressure on her husband. Rishi Sunak is a practicing Hindu and he will become the first Asian Prime Minister. And it is Diwali. And 2 years ago, as Chancellor, when it was Diwali, he lit candles outside Number 11, and he's since said that was one of his proudest achievements in politics. Well, with me now is our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. Well, this is another big moment, Nick, another Prime Minister.
It's a huge moment, Joanna, partly because Rishi Sunak is someone who will come into this office with some of the biggest challenges that any Prime Minister in modern history has faced. I said that 7 weeks ago in Downing Street when Liz Truss took over, but the challenges that Rishi Sunak is going to face have only gone up over the past few weeks. He is going to have to try and steady the ship economically. We have a rough idea about how he wants to do that, because he's talked about sound fiscal management, about not borrowing too much, about balancing the books. He did that during the summer anyway. But as you were just saying, we've not heard from Rishi Sunak in public for weeks. He has not spoken at all to any broadcaster, in any interview, to anyone really, apart from behind closed doors, about what he wants to do with power. It's a week today, as things stand, until the next big fiscal statement from the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is supposed to happen in the House of Commons. I suspect they will want to keep that date because they want to make their intervention in the economy before the Bank of England makes its next big decision on interest rates. But Rishi Sunak will enter number 10 facing a huge, daunting entry. The economy at home, the war in Ukraine, global questions about inflation, about supply economics, about how exactly you steady the ship without spooking markets even further. And then, all that time, he will be facing questions from opposition parties and even some of his own MPs, it seems, about whether he needs to call a general election to get a mandate to do what he wants to do. All the expectation in the Conservative Party and in Parliament in general is that the next government under Mr Sunak is going to have to make extremely difficult economic decisions. That means cuts, and it may mean taxes going up in some senses. And there will be questions, I think, about whether Mr Sunak has the mandate to do that, given that Boris Johnson was the one who won the election back in 2019. Liz Truss was the one who won the vote of Conservative members just 7 weeks ago. Mr Sunak has now been put in place by his MPs.
Just before I go on to talk about the economics with Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, just another word about the politics, because you said Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, will be delivering that fiscal statement on the 31st. What's expected in terms of whether the people currently in those key posts actually will stay?
I don't know, is the simple answer. I've asked Team Sunak, and the whole time that we've been asking these questions, they've said they're not getting ahead of themselves, so they're not making those decisions. My hunch is that given that Mr Hunt has managed to steady the ship a bit, that he is likely to stay as Chancellor for stability, if for no other reason. But we will find out, I suspect, more about that tomorrow. My expectation is we won't see Liz Truss leave number 10 today and Mr Sunak enter. I'd expect that to happen tomorrow by the time all the logistics get sorted out. And if Mr Sunak is in there by tomorrow afternoon, he will then have to start that job of putting together his cabinet, of getting around the table with his top team, including his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, or whoever that may be, and figuring out what tough choices they are going to make to try and balance the books, to try and steady the economy. A lot of people have asked privately over the last few weeks who would want to be Prime Minister, given all the challenges that the country's facing at the moment. Rishi Sunak will take up that job tomorrow.
Thank you, Nick. Well, let's pick up with the economic conversation with Paul Johnson, Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And Paul Johnson, how difficult are those choices that he's going to have to make going to be?
Well, there are certainly some very difficult choices coming down the road. The public finances are not in a great position, despite the undoing of most of the tax cuts that were announced a month or so ago. And one of the problems, I think, that the new Prime Minister and his Chancellor face is that given all of the uncertainty that's been created over the last few weeks, they may have to make more difficult decisions than they otherwise would have had to, because the markets are still somewhat spooked, and they're going to be wanting to see some clear and decisive action, perhaps more than they would have required had we not had all of this upset over the last few weeks.
And that brings us back to a question that's been asked a number of times since the so-called mini-budget. Who's in charge in the end? Is it the markets?
Well, the markets, in some sense, are always in charge. I mean, we are all part of the markets. The decisions that we as citizens make matter enormously for what's happening to the economy, but also the decisions that people who we are borrowing from as a nation make. I mean, don't forget, this is all about us borrowing hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds, and someone has to be willing to lend us that money. And if they stop being willing to lend us that money because they're unconvinced about the stability of the government or the extent to which their fiscal policies make sense, then they don't have to lend us that money. We are beholden to them. But all that means is that we need a sustainable, sensible, rational fiscal policy. Now, what we saw on September the 23rd was a government deviating from that to some quite considerable degree. That still leaves an enormous amount of scope for very different policies. You can see that Germany and France, the USA and Australia have completely different sets of policies. They're all well-functioning economies in one sense or another. You just have to make choices within constraints and recognise those constraints. So yes, we are constrained by what we do. We can't just do whatever we want because things cost money, and we can't just magic up economic activity from nowhere. And I think that was the mistake that the previous Chancellor made.
When you say there is an enormous amount of scope for different policies, how much scope is there? I mean, where are you thinking there is scope? Because the rowing back of the tax cuts that was announced previously, I think your estimates were that it would save, well, no, the Chancellor said it would save £23 billion of public spending, but then I think that your estimates were that there'd be still a £40 billion black hole. Does that get filled by spending cuts? I mean, it's a lot of spending cuts, or it's a lot of tax rises. So how much scope is there for flexibility?
Well, there's long-term and short-term questions that we need to answer as a country. In the long term, we need to decide whether we want to be a country more like most of those in Western Europe, where there are much higher levels of tax and much higher levels of public spending than we have here, or whether we want to be a country like some of the others, often the Anglophone countries in the OECD, the US, Australia, Canada, which have lower levels of tax and lower levels of spending. What we can't have, obviously, is low tax and high spending. So that's what I meant by the scope of the choices that are available. In the shorter term, it looks like we're going to have either some relatively modest increases in taxation or some quite difficult cuts in spending in order to get us towards a fiscally sustainable position. But we are in the midst of huge economic uncertainty. So I think the ideal position to be in would be to say, actually, we're not going to make big decisions in the short run. We're going to wait and see where we are in a year or two. And that's where I do wonder whether the current uncertainty makes that perfectly sensible decision more difficult to achieve, because everything is so spooked that saying, well, we'll make those hard decisions in a year or two might look even less credible than it would have done just a few months ago.
What is your sense of what it's going to look like? It's been said that it's going to be austerity that's going to be a lot harder than it was under the coalition government because of what's happening with inflation.
Well, even if the government, the Chancellor, doesn't make any further decisions, the next couple of years are going to be quite difficult from a public spending perspective, because, of course, the public spending plans were put in place a year ago when we expected inflation to be only 2 or 3%, and it's turning out at 10%. We've already seen that in terms of public sector pay going up much, much less quickly than prices and rather less quickly than pay in the private sector, and that's likely to continue over the next couple of years. So continuing to pay our teachers and nurses and so on much less in real terms than they have historically been used to is going to be very difficult to achieve. If you want to do more than that, if you want to cut spending further, particularly, of course, since we've come off a decade of incredibly tight spending settlements, that's just going to be very hard. And you look at where the big spending is, biggest by far is the health service. Well, I don't see any government cutting the health service. Then the next is pensions. We've already seen the government's not wanting to reduce pensions, then working age welfare, which goes to the poorest people in the country, then education. Where do you get significant cuts out of all of those, genuinely, both politically and economically hard?
Thank you very much. That's Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And just to say that we're looking at the Palace of Westminster, and that is where Rishi Sunak is currently speaking to MPs as the incoming Prime Minister. It's behind closed doors, so we don't have cameras on it, but word will start to come out about what is being said, and we're keeping a watchful eye on that, and we'll bring you comments from inside that closed session as soon as we hear any word. OK, well, let's go to Fiona Trott, who's in Wakefield, gauging reaction there. Fiona.
There's been quite a positive reaction here so far from people, because they say, as Chancellor, he got us through the pandemic, he helped businesses through furlough, perhaps he can help us through the cost of living crisis too. Let me introduce you, though, to Julie and Michelle. Julie, first of all, tell me what you think of Rishi Sunak becoming the new Prime Minister.
No, thank you. He wasn't elected by the people, and I think that is the big no-no. I think that after 3 Prime Ministers in a short period of time, we should have a general election. We should be allowed to elect who we want in Parliament, not just the members.
Michelle, what do you think?
I agree with Julie. I mean, yes, they might have his ideas and what he wants to do, but at the moment I just feel that the government, the Conservative government and the politicians are 100% behind him, because there's a lot of them as well who are wanting other people in, and I think it's going to be a hard task to get them all together to put into place his policies where he wants to put in, and to hopefully bring us back to some sort of normality, not poverty, what we are at the moment.
What's normality for you? What do you want him to deliver for you?
I'd like to see a better NHS. I'd like to see for families with young people with disabilities and people with disabilities, whatever age, being able to live and not thinking about what the food that they need to get in, the gas, their electricity. I think there's a lot of things at the moment where people are more worried about how they're going to live the next year.
Julie, what do you want from the new Prime Minister?
I'd like to see a better NHS. I mean, I've been waiting 4 years now for a new knee. 9 years trying to find a dentist. It's not good. The NHS is literally on its knees, and it's wrong. Mental health is suffering. It's just so wrong.
Do you think Rishi Sunak and the new cabinet can achieve that, solve the NHS? The social, we know that the national insurance tax is not going to go up to help pay for that. So what do you think going forward?
I don't think they will. I really don't think they will. I think they make all these promises and nothing happens. It's been this way for too many years now. You know, we're promised the earth and it just doesn't happen. So no, I don't think he can solve it.
What do you think?
I just feel the money what we had as a country has dwindled. I mean, yes, COVID didn't help, and yes, they did back up by putting furlough and that in, and it helped keep jobs, but I just think the money situation for families and the government, there's nothing there to improve what we're at the moment.
What do you say though when politicians turn around and say, look, this is the situation that we're in, you know, we've had the problems with the Ukraine and, you know, the cost of living crisis, these are all things that we couldn't foresee. Yes. It's going to be a long journey, but we're going to get there in the end.
Yeah, so that's the whole question, that's a hard question to ask, but I just feel that, like as I said earlier, I don't think he's got the support behind him to put in place what really needs to be put in place.
But do you have faith in him?
No, I don't. No, if I'm honest, I don't. I'd rather it go to a general election and let people choose.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for chatting to us here in Wakefield today. So there we are. I think the real challenge for the new Prime Minister at the moment is that in places like Wakefield in the past relied so much on manufacturing and coal mining, and now it needs to be levelled up. It's something that Wakefield has asked for, and that's a challenge for the new Prime Minister. It promised in 2019 to deliver on that, but now faced with these new challenges, I think people here, although they say that some of them think that he's the right person for the job, they're less positive, less optimistic if they think that he will actually achieve that in the future.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Let me just bring you some of the flavour of what's going on behind closed doors where Rishi Sunak is addressing Tory MPs. Ione Wells, our political correspondent, says he went into a room of backbench Tory MPs accompanied by some of his loyal backers and received a rapturous round of applause and banging of fists on desks by Tory MPs in the room. She says, remember, a lot of them wanted him to be Prime Minister earlier this summer too, after he came top of the MP's rounds of voting in the first leadership race, and that was before he lost out to Liz Truss in the party members' vote. So he is currently speaking to them. How much he will be revealing of his programme of government, we've yet to find out, because he hasn't said anything on camera in terms of what his plans will be. What we had when it was confirmed that he was standing to be Tory leader and Prime Minister was just a tweet outlining his desire to do that. So there's going to be a lot, obviously, of questions being asked of him inside that meeting in terms of the pledges that he will be making. So he is going to have a very full in-tray. He's got to prepare for that new fiscal statement next week. The economic situation is significantly worse than it was when Liz Truss took office. Higher mortgage rates, energy bills and inflation are all combining to make it a really tough winter for many people. The NHS and the social care system are struggling, and the war in Ukraine, which is driving those high energy bills, continues to grind on. Well, speaking before it was announced that Rishi Sunak would be the next Prime Minister, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said any change at the top is bad news for Scottish people.
You know, whoever it is in number 10, and let's assume it's going to be Rishi Sunak, a Chancellor, remember, who has already been one of the authors of the economic and cost of living crisis that the UK is living through right now. But whoever it is, the real worry is the next phase of austerity that a week today is going to be unleashed. That's what Scotland needs an alternative to, because it's not inevitable. It's being made the case by Brexit, by Tory economic mismanagement. It does not have to be this way. And Tories want us to believe, and Labour to a certain extent as well, want us to believe that life outside the European Union with these austerity cuts is as good as it gets. It shouldn't be as good as it gets, and for Scotland it's not as good as it gets. We need an alternative to that. Well, look, Rishi Sunak will be yet another Tory Prime Minister that Scotland hasn't voted for. And if Scotland was given the opportunity today, I would bet my bottom dollar that Scotland would not vote for Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. So this is the position Scotland is in, having to cross our fingers and hope for the least worst option in terms of UK governments. And again, I would say we can do better than this. We can choose our own governments, and we can actually apply our own values to leading Scotland on the track that we want, rather than being taken down the wrong track by successive UK governments. Back in the European Union and in charge of our own destiny. That's what independence offers Scotland, and it's got to be better than this chaos and economic carnage that is being inflicted on us by one Tory Prime Minister after another.
Nicola Sturgeon. Well, let's talk now to the political historian at University College London, Dr. Sam Blacksford. Welcome. So we have our fifth Conservative Prime Minister in 6 years. Give us your perspective as an historian.
Well, it's unprecedented. We say that all the time, but this genuinely is. The Conservative Party used to make a virtue of having leaders who were in position for a very long time. People were very loyal to them. And now we've had this succession of quite short-term prime ministers who've been, by historic standards, quite lightweight. And it just doesn't reflect very well on the party. And of course, it doesn't really bode well for the country either. There's been a very significant issue here, which is that, especially with Liz Truss, but to an extent Boris Johnson as well, was that the decision to choose who the Prime Minister would be was actually farmed out to Conservative Party members. Now, that's not historically a very consistent thing that's been done. That's a very recent thing from the 2000s. What we've seen today with Rishi Sunak being essentially selected unopposed, or having not to go to a contest amongst the members, is much more consistent with the longer term ways of doing things. And actually that's a much more coherent way and a more constitutional way of selecting a prime minister, because ultimately a prime minister needs to command the support of their fellow MPs, and that's one of the reasons why Liz Truss failed.
And so do you think that is going to be conducive to greater unity going forward for him?
It can't be a bad thing for him, I would imagine, because at the end of the day, you need to get your business through the House of Commons by having your MPs, your backbench MPs supporting you. And it's very clear from the numbers that Rishi Sunak has amassed in the past couple of days that he is the one who can achieve that. You know, there was always obviously some temptation to bring Boris Johnson back, because despite all his flaws and all his failures in this looming privileges committee, etc., he was a very good campaigner. But ultimately, he was tarnished, and you've now got someone who might be able to reach out to people across the country, but also will be able to, like I say, command the support of his MPs, which is the really crucial thing that they need. But let's be frank about this. At the end of the day, Sunak faces a set of challenges that are almost again unprecedented. It's going to be an incredibly difficult winter, and the public support for the Conservative Party is at absolute rock bottom. It was at rock bottom anyway after 12 years of government. Governments tend to get tired and people lose or get out of favour of them. But with what's happened in the past 6-8 weeks, which has looked terribly self-indulgent on the part of the Conservative Party, having this long leadership contest and then this very short stint as Liz Truss Prime Minister, Sunak is going to have a lot of luck to pull the party's fortunes back from here.
And there are a lot of calls for there to be a general election. There's no constitutional imperative for that, but would you expect those calls to remain?
I expect there to be the calls to remain. I don't expect them to be heeded, because the Conservative Party are absolutely not going to call a general election now, because they'd lose probably hundreds of seats based on the current polling. Like you say, it's not constitutional. There's no real need to have a general election. We don't vote in prime ministers. We vote in parties, and the Conservative Party has a majority in Parliament at the moment. That's what matters. But I do sympathise with people, political opponents, members of the public, people who you were just speaking to then a minute ago before Nicola Sturgeon, who say that they want a general election, because ultimately, if you just see prime minister after prime minister after prime minister who then go and try and do different things, you can understand why the public might want their say. But constitutionally, there's no need to have one.
Dr. Sam Blacksford, political historian from University College London. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, with me as our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. How do you expect things to unfold from here, Nick?
Well, look, I think Rishi Sunak will become Prime Minister formally probably tomorrow now. The logistics of getting it done today are probably too much. So that moment where Liz Truss emerges, leaves, goes to the palace, and Rishi Sunak then arrives, and the King will have that transition for the first time. Then when Rishi Sunak comes back here and addresses the nation, that will probably happen tomorrow. I suspect a lot of people will want to hear from the new Prime Minister before then, given that he has said nothing publicly as part of this campaign, apart from a couple of tweets. I have spoken to one MP who was in the room at the 1922 committee, who says they were impressed by Mr Sunak. He said that the party needed to unite and to get on with delivering a cabinet that had all the talents in it, and maybe a hint that he's going to look at a broad range of the party to try and get some sort of unity. But it's likely to be tomorrow that we get those big moments where Rishi Sunak sets out his vision to the country, tells us who's going to be in his cabinet, whether Jeremy Hunt remains as Chancellor, for example, who else he wants in his top team. It's going to be a really significant moment, because the challenges that Mr Sunak is going to face in that famous black door are quite something. You know, the economic challenges, the political challenges that he faces as a Conservative Prime Minister, given the turmoil of the last few years in his party, are going to be significant as well.
What does he stand for? What's his brand of conservatism?
Well, look, I think we got a good idea over the summer that he wants to govern in a way that balances the books, that doesn't borrow a lot of money for everyday spending on government initiatives or on cutting taxes or anything like that, like Liz Truss did. He will be different to that. I suspect he will want to balance the books as quickly as he can and make it clear he wants to do that. But it's a really interesting question, Joanna, because we heard from Rishi Sunak over the summer where he almost became defined as not Liz Truss. His warnings were all about Liz Truss and what she planned. His allies would say he was proved right. The big question is, given all the chaos we've seen over the last few weeks and the worsening economic pictures, what actual concrete decisions he's going to take now.
Thank you very much, Nick, and that is the key question. He's currently speaking to Conservative MPs. How much detail he'll be giving them, it's probably not likely to be going into much detail. What we do know is he received a warm welcome from those MPs as he begins his new position as Prime Minister. Now, time for a look at the weather with Stav.
Hello there. This upcoming week is remaining fairly unsettled with low pressure nearby, and with low pressure to the west of us out in the Atlantic, it means we're going to continue to see south or southwesterly winds. So temperatures will remain above the seasonal norm throughout the week in all areas, and there will be further rain at times, but also some sunshine too. But it's going to be very mild both by day and by night. Now, through this evening and overnight, any showers will affect more northern and western areas. It'll tend to stay drier further south and east that you are. And with the breeze, the cloud, temperatures no lower than around 7 to 11 degrees, so very mild. So here it is, our area of low pressure sitting out to the west of us, bringing in these south-southwesterly winds. Weather front spiralling the area of low pressure, though, will bring bouts of rain followed by showers at times. But actually Tuesday not looking bad at all. A lot of dry weather to start the day. It stays dry, plenty of sunshine through central, northern and eastern areas. Maybe just an odd shower around. But later in the day we'll start to see this next feature pushing into the southwest quadrant, bringing more substantial rain. Another breezy day, lighter winds further north and east, so feeling very pleasant with temperatures up to 14 to 18 degrees. As we move into Wednesday, this feature will bring wetter, windier weather to much of the north and the west of the country. And at this point, from middle part of the week, we'll start to see some very mild air moving up from the south for all areas, as you can see from the deeper orange colours there. So Wednesday, then, a more unsettled day. Heavy rain will spill its way northwards, accompanied by strong winds. That'll be followed by blustery showers and sunny spells into the afternoon. Some of these could be heavy and thundery. Better chance of staying dry and brighter further south and east, where we could be seeing temperatures reaching around the 20 Celsius mark here, mid to high teens further north and west. Similar stories we head into Thursday. Again, run of south or southwesterly winds, further showers at times. Some of these could be quite heavy. Initially across England and Wales, they'll push northwards into Scotland and Northern Ireland. And then into the afternoon, I think we should start to see some sunny spells developing. And with that southerly breeze, the sunshine could be very mild indeed on Thursday, perhaps up to 21, maybe 22 degrees across the southeast through the afternoon, high teens further north and west. And we hold on to that theme through Friday and the weekend. Very mild, quite breezy. Most of the rain and showers in the north and the west. Better chance of staying dry with some sunshine in the south and the east.
Right, this idea that there are wokists forcing their ideology on people really does rally the right.
I think it goes much further than the right.
I haven't seen anything quite so melodramatic.
You think it stands out?
People are actually deciding either to buy a pullover and not turn the heating on.
I'm getting old, but even I can only remember one moment when the pound was weaker against the dollar. We ask why and whether it matters.
There's always more to the story with our podcasts. Listen on BBC Sounds.
This is BBC News. I'm Joanna Gosling, live from Downing Street, where Rishi Sunak has been announced as the UK's next Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party.
I can confirm that we have received one valid nomination. And Rishi Sunak is therefore elected as leader of the Conservative Party.
The former Chancellor will become the UK's first British Asian Prime Minister and the youngest for more than a century, as senior figures in the party call for unity.
There is no point in refighting the arguments of the summer. The only thing now in the minds of my Conservative parliamentary colleagues should be supporting the Prime Minister, supporting the government, supporting the British people.
Rishi Sunak addresses Conservative MPs in private after the announcement. Stay with us for updates throughout the day. Good afternoon and welcome to BBC News if you're watching in the UK or around the world. 7 weeks after losing to Liz Truss in this year's first Tory leadership contest, Rishi Sunak has now emerged victor in this second one. He is set to become the UK's next Prime Minister tomorrow, the first from a British Asian background. He'll take office as the country faces enormous economic challenges. The ex-Chancellor, who is currently addressing Conservative MPs in private, gained the support of well over half of Conservative MPs, with his rival Penny Mordaunt struggling to reach the threshold needed to go forward in the contest of 100 nominations. Rishi Sunak is likely to formally become the Prime Minister tomorrow. King Charles will be heading back to London this afternoon from Sandringham, his estate in Norfolk, and he will invite the ex-Chancellor then to form a government. Here's the moment the announcement of the winner of the leadership election was made by Sir Graham Brady, who chairs the committee running the contest, in front of a noisy group of MPs.
Good afternoon. As returning officer in the leadership election, I can confirm that we have received one valid nomination. And Rishi Sunak is therefore elected as leader of the Conservative Party.
Graham Brady making that announcement. Well, let's take a look at our next Prime Minister. The former Chancellor Rishi Sunak had been the favourite to succeed his old boss Boris Johnson as Prime Minister after his resignation in July. But he failed to persuade Tory members who ultimately put Liz Truss in Downing Street in September. Rishi Sunak, who has not commented on the recent turmoil, said he was standing as Prime Minister to fix a profound economic crisis as well as to unite his party. He became Chancellor in February 2020, and within weeks he found himself having to steer the UK economy as the pandemic and its lockdowns began. In April, the finances of Rishi Sunak and his family came under intense scrutiny, with the tax affairs of his heiress wife Akshata Murthy placed in the spotlight. She later announced she would start paying UK tax on her overseas earnings to relieve political pressure on her husband. Rishi Sunak is a practicing Hindu and will become the first Asian Prime Minister. And it is Diwali today, and when he was Chancellor 2 years ago and it was Diwali, he lit the candles outside number 11 Downing Street. He said it was one of his proudest moments of his political career. So potentially tonight he could be lighting those candles outside number 10. With me, our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. Might he be in number 10 before the end of the day?
I think it's unlikely. I think the logistics of getting Liz Truss out and getting the King ready to receive both Liz Truss and Mr Sunak and getting Mr Sunak in probably mean that it's tomorrow that Rishi Sunak formally becomes Prime Minister. 7 weeks to the day since Liz Truss took over here. And it will be a really significant and difficult moment because Mr Sunak takes over in really challenging economic times that have got considerably worse since the leadership election that we saw over the summer. And standing here this afternoon, we're in the extraordinary position where we know there will be a new Prime Minister, probably this time tomorrow. We know who they are. We haven't heard them say anything about what they want to do beyond a statement confirming that they were standing. Now, Mr Sunak has just been appearing before Conservative MPs. I think he'll probably want to speak to the nation at some point, but there will be that moment tomorrow afternoon where Mr Sunak will stand in front of the nation and will have to set out how he intends to steer the ship economically and how he intends to get things running smoothly again.
We've got a tweet from Liz Truss saying, "Congratulations, Rishi Sunak, on being appointed as leader of the Conservative Party and our next Prime Minister. You have my full support." Well, she goes down in history as being the shortest serving Prime Minister, and he is the youngest for a very, very long time.
What a turnaround, because it was only 7 weeks ago today that Ms Truss fairly comfortably beat Mr Sunak in the leadership campaign, you know, with that vote of Conservative members who seem to like her pledge for lower taxes, to govern in a more Conservative way. They are not going to get that with Mr Sunak. He is going to have to tighten belts, and that means that I think in the immediate term, tax cuts are off the agenda. Remember that towards the end of the last campaign, Mr Sunak was promising some pretty big tax cuts over the next few years to bring down income tax by 4p by the end of the next Parliament. No word from his campaign yet about whether that prospect is ditched, but we know that the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has made it clear that the plan to even take income tax down by a penny has been postponed indefinitely. Likewise for Mr Sunak, that big question about what he wants to do on energy support. He was promising targeted interventions during the leadership campaign of the summer. Well, Liz Truss is spending a lot of money on getting people through the next 6 months. Her plan to do it for 2 years was curtailed by the new Chancellor, but Mr Sunak has to set out his plans on that. So, you know, I'd like to tell you a lot more about what Mr Sunak wants to do when he's in there tomorrow, but we don't know for sure, and it will be his responsibility to start setting that out to the country very, very soon.
Thank you, Nick. And we are only a week away from the fiscal statement, which is going to be outlined by the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. We expect it to still be him in the position of Chancellor, and that will be giving detail on what the economic plans will look like going forward. Well, let's go to our correspondent Helen Catt, who's in Central Lobby. What is the mood among Tory MPs, Helen?
Central Lobby has been busier in the last couple of hours than I've seen it in quite a while as MPs come along, and all the talk is of unity. But in terms of what Rishi Sunak might do as Prime Minister, what he's promising, well, I have someone with me who might be able to shed a little bit of light on that for us. This is Miriam Cage. She's the MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge in South Yorkshire. Rishi Sunak's been talking to Conservative MPs in the last hour. What's he said to you?
Well, he's told us about his manifesto, really, which is to stand on the 2019 manifesto. That's what we were all elected on. That hasn't changed. A manifesto commitment to unite, to level up and to deliver on the promises of Brexit, which we've still yet to complete. So it's very much about that, about continuing the manifesto. But I think also he called on us to be united, of course, and that's being well reported. But I think very astutely he pointed out that most of our divisions as a party over the last 6 months that have been so widely reported have not really been about policy. I mean, of course, there are policy differences in a broad church in the Conservative Party, but actually it's been much more about personality and character and the kind of events that have been so widely reported. And a lot of that political discord and turmoil, has been our own fault, let's be honest. But it's been the divisions about personality rather than policy that have brought us to this situation. So I think he pointed out that actually we can unite around the policy. This is the time to do it.
Why will that change if it's about personality? Because it's the same people in Parliament. That hasn't changed.
Well, I think who the leader is has a huge impact on how willing MPs are to follow that leader. There is no leader without followers. And I think what we saw at the end of Boris Johnson's time in office, and I supported Boris Johnson to the last, was increasing number and increasing proportion of MPs who just weren't willing to follow him as leader. We've seen that with Liz. But I think Rishi, over just 3 days, has managed to garner the support of nearly 2/3 of the party who are willing to.
Although some of those are just doing it for unity. There's probably the core of real Sunak believers, if you like, would arguably be a lot smaller.
Well, I think if you think back to 2019 in the leadership race that Boris Johnson won, in the final round of MP voting, he only got 51% of the vote. So, of course, he was a well-loved, liked leader with a lot of respect, but it wasn't the case that he commanded the vast majority of the parliamentary party. And I think the key thing is no leader is ever going to have the full support of the whole party. We're too broad a church. But what they need to have is the respect of those people who wouldn't necessarily call that person their first choice, and Rishi absolutely has the respect of our party.
And can he win in constituencies like yours?
Well, that isn't actually a question for now, because the question for now is, can we stabilise this economic situation and can we use that stability to deliver on our manifesto commitments? And at the end of the day, when the next general election comes, we will be judged on that. Have we delivered on levelling up? Have we delivered on our other promises?
Miriam Cates, thank you very much. So one initial response there for you. As you heard, Rishi Sunak, as the new Conservative leader, has been talking to his MPs here in Parliament. We'll have to wait a bit longer to hear from him to speak to the country.
Thank you, Helen. And I'm just seeing that he has told MPs there will not be a general election. That's the intention. There will not be a general election. There needs to be party unity and discipline in order to avoid a general election. So let's see whether that is delivered. But by the fact that he has been anointed by the support of his MPs, it is indicating some MPs are saying that there is, and some experts are saying that there is more likely to be unity going forward. Well, Rishi Sunak is of course going to be the UK's next Prime Minister after Penny Mordaunt dropped out of the Tory leadership race in the final minutes before nominations closed. Let's get more reaction to it by Professor Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University. Welcome. Well, we'll come to him saying there won't be a general election in a moment, but first of all, your reaction to the fact that it's Rishi Sunak and that he's done it without having to go to a wider vote.
Well, I think, to be honest, that was the direction in which this contest was heading for quite a while. It was pretty clear within hours of Boris Johnson indicating that he might attempt to enter the contest, is that while there was undoubtedly a body of MPs who are loyal to him, and that he would indeed certainly do pretty well amongst the membership, there was by no means guaranteed to win. that he might well struggle to form an administration because there'll be so many MPs who wouldn't be willing to take part in a Boris Johnson-led government that he would be in trouble. And of course, we also then got reminded about his involvement in Partygate. So I think the truth is that a realistic assessment of Boris Johnson's chances, the moment it became clear he was going to he might try, was that his chances didn't look very good indeed. Penny Mordaunt's problem, meanwhile, is rather different. Her problem, I think, at the end of the day, she's just not well enough known to be somebody to be able to convince MPs that she should be taking on somebody like Rishi Sunak at this point, given that the problem the Conservatives face above all now is the way in which their economic credibility has been squandered by the economic events of the last 4 weeks, and that above all, what the Conservatives have to do in the next 2 years is try to turn both the finances of the government around, and in the wake of that, to try to turn the economy around, both of which are at the moment sitting in accident and emergency in bad need of some political and economic medicine.
So Rishi Sunak has said there will not be an early general election. Will that be within his gift? Will there be the unity that is required for that to be the case?
Well, you're right. The only reason why Mr. Sunak's wish not to have a general election would not be able to hold water is if he isn't able to maintain the confidence of the House of Commons. And that gets us back to, the crucial question is, can he get his party more united? Now, I think he will have fewer problems than Boris Johnson would have had, but he'll certainly have problems, and he will certainly find that on a day-to-day basis that a combination of personal animosities and ideological division will mean that he may well have to duck and weave and tack on various occasions in order to avoid defeat inside the House of Commons. So, his first difficult task will be to work out how to deal with the tax increases and spending cuts that are required. There are clearly some Conservative MPs who would prefer to see spending cuts rather than tax increases, but others who feel that if spending cuts means doing particular damage to the poor, including those on welfare benefits, they won't be happy. So he's going to have to negotiate a potentially difficult path there. Levelling up, well, we discovered during his own leadership campaign in the summer that levelling up means different things to different people and can cause a certain amount of animosity and difficulty amongst Conservative MPs and Conservative members inside the south of England. Brexit, well, the party's not divided over the principle of Brexit, but there are still arguments about how it should be implemented. And that's going to come to the fore very quickly. The government's going to have to decide by Friday as to whether or not to allow an election in Northern Ireland to go ahead, given that the DUP are not still willing to form an administration because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So there are plenty of potential headaches here. But the fact that he has managed, in effect, to achieve a coronation will give him an early boost of authority inside his party. He will also be helped if, and it's probably reasonably likely, that there is at least some recovery in the Conservative position in the polls, and that therefore he can demonstrate to his MPs that there is at least some short-term political dividend in the fact that he has become leader.
Professor Sir John Curtis, thank you very much. Well, let's get some reaction from the SNP MP for Aberdeen South, Stephen Flynn. Welcome. So he has been anointed as the new Conservative Party leader, the new Prime Minister. Does that mean it's looking less likely that you'll get the general election that you want to see?
I think what we've just heard there in relation to the general election is that Rishi Sunak is running scared. He's running scared of a general election, just as he's running scared of an independence referendum, which of course is our focus at this moment in time. But to take a little bit of a Scottish perspective on this is just another Tory Prime Minister, just another Tory Prime Minister that the people of Scotland didn't vote for. He's the 10th since 1955, and it highlights the real democratic deficit that sits at the heart of this union. Obviously, people right across the UK are reeling at this moment in time from the fact that we have a Prime Minister who is now going to be in place that the public haven't voted on. But that's not an uncommon thing for people in Scotland when it comes to Tory Prime Ministers.
You talk obviously about the Scottish perspective and the desire for an independence referendum, which the SNP are being very clear about. But if Rishi Sunak can run a tight ship, if there is going to be unity, stability, we may be 2 years away from a general election. And of course, the position from Westminster very much is that this is not the time for an independence referendum.
The unity and the stability that the people of Scotland need is to have governments that we vote for and governments that implement policies that are, in our view, the right ones to do. That's why we have Scottish parliamentary elections and the SNP are successful, and of course the Tories are not. Yet despite that, we still have Tory governments imposed upon us time after time, and this is just another example of that. But Rishi Sunak, when you look at his policies, is actually quite scary. This is a man who during the summer said quite clearly that he was happy to take money from poorer areas to put it into wealthier communities. This is a guy who during the pandemic, of course, provided no financial support whatsoever to some 3 million people they excluded as they came to be known. And of course, much like Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak was fined during, as a result of his actions during Partygate. He is not quite clearly fit for office, and he has no mandate, not just from the people of the UK, but from the people of Scotland.
Stephen Flynn for the SNP, thank you. Well, Rishi Sunak, who will be the next Prime Minister, will have an in-tray full of huge challenges. The economic situation is significantly worse than it was when Liz Truss took office. Higher mortgage rates, energy bills and inflation are all combining to make it a really tough winter for many people. The NHS and social care system is struggling, and the war in Ukraine, which is driving those high energy bills, continues to grind on. The challenges facing the new Prime Minister, as I mentioned, are daunting. So let's talk now to Andy Verity for more on those challenges. Andy.
Well, Joanna, you're right. There are huge economic challenges. We've got at the moment what you call stagflation, a combination of the economy stagnating and the worst inflation in 40 years. The pound has devalued. It's lost more than a fifth of its value since the start of this calendar year. But some of the signs on the markets today have been signalling that there's relief, at least, that Boris Johnson isn't going back to Downing Street, and perhaps also that Rishi Sunak is going to be the one to replace him as Conservative Party leader. So, for example, that key interest rate that we've been watching, the yield on 5-year gilts, I'll translate that for you, is the cost of borrowing at a fixed interest rate over 5 years. Whatever it costs the government, it's got to cost the mortgage lenders a little bit more. So at the moment, there's been a big move in that. When we heard that Boris Johnson wasn't going to run, the markets reacted by cutting that. In other words, saying the risks have lessened, we don't need quite as much interest to compensate for our risk of lending to the UK government, and it dropped by 30 basis points, 30 hundredths of a percentage point. So that was a relief, if you like, that the anxiety they had on Friday, which pushed those interest rates up, was not there anymore. And then they extended that after the news about Rishi Sunak by a few more points. So that's saying we're not worried about Rishi Sunak at the very least, and we're certainly glad that he's not Boris Johnson.
We're a week away from the fiscal statement. Of course, we saw what happened with the market reaction to the mini budget. The markets, as you're saying, have already effectively priced in what they think a Rishi Sunak premiership will mean.
Well, that's right. I mean, they've priced in what Jeremy Hunt has done, and a big question they'll be asking now is, will we still have the same thing from the Chancellor? Will we still have Jeremy Hunt's plans on the table? And I think they'll be loath to depart too much from that because of the risk of a bond market sell-off if they get it wrong. But we should remember that even after Jeremy Hunt trimmed back Kwasi Kwarteng's big tax cuts, they're still spending substantially more than they planned to, say, a few months ago, because they're spending more on the energy bill help for households and businesses. That's a good 60 billion or so added to it. So they're not funding everything. They're not coming up with a corresponding tax rise or spending cut for everything that the government is giving away. And there's a key question here, which is of timing. It's not just a binary thing. Either you do austerity or you get murdered on the markets. It's a question of timing. You might do expansionary policies now, putting more money into households' finances now and businesses to compensate for the energy price shock, and then do spending cuts or tax rises later further down the line in order to present a credible plan of this is how we get the finances back on track. But what I think very few economists would advocate is that going into a recession, they'd want to do deep spending cuts, more austerity. We've learned the lesson from 12 years ago when, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, government said we've got to fix the public finances now. And what that led to was weak growth and the worst decade for improvements in living standards in 200 years. They won't want to repeat those mistakes.
Thank you very much, Andy. Well, Labour have reiterated their call for a general election, as have the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrats. We can talk to the Liberal Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper. Welcome. What is your reaction to the anointment of Rishi Sunak?
Well, he's the third out-of-touch Conservative Prime Minister in just as many months. And the situation, quite frankly, is that people are sick and tired of this Conservative chaos. And that's why the Liberal Democrats are calling for a general election to be called right now.
And I'm so sorry, I couldn't hear you just then because something was happening in my ear. So I completely missed what you said. But you obviously are calling for a general election. Rishi Sunak has said that there will not be a general election. If he can deliver stability and unity within his party, there won't be a general election. Nothing can force one for another 2 years.
Well, I think what's important for Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party to realise is that it is the Conservative Party itself that has caused so much chaos and so much instability. And the only way to get rid of that chaos and instability is to remove the Conservative Party from government. There is overwhelming support across the country for a general election. I think it's outrageous that we are now on the third Conservative Prime Minister in just as many months, and the public are not being given a say in who they want to take the country forward and to solve these unprecedented crises. The fact is there has to be a general election because that's the only way that we can move forward from the chaos and instability that the Conservative Party itself has created.
But what we see is that the markets are stabilising, that Rishi Sunak is... they've responded well to the thought that it was going to be Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. Why not, if you're so concerned about stability, let that settle, see what happens? And would that not be preferable to a general election right now, which would actually just bring more uncertainty?
Well, the markets, as you say, do appear to have improved slightly, but the situation facing struggling families across the country has not. The fact is that Rishi Sunak refused to implement a proper windfall tax. He was supporting Boris Johnson even when he was proven to be a liar and a lawbreaker. This is a man who boasted during the leadership contest in the summer about taking money away from poor communities and giving it to richer communities. We have a twin-demic facing the NHS and our care services, and our health and care services have been run into the ground by these successive Conservative Prime Ministers. There are so many problems facing our country right now, and it's clear from months of infighting and years of infighting that the Conservative Party does not have a plan and cannot be trusted. They are out of touch and they should be out of government.
Thank you very much for joining us. Well, let me just take you live to those pictures that we can see on the screen right now, and that's outside Conservative HQ. We can see Matt Hancock there talking with others as they wait for Rishi Sunak to come out on the steps of the Conservative Party's headquarters to speak to them gathered there. He's already been speaking to Tory MPs inside the Commons behind closed doors. We know he got a rapturous reception inside that meeting, and he told the MPs there will not be an early general election. With me, our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. So, Nick, we're going to hear from him shortly, we think.
Yeah, Jake Berry, the Conservative chairman, there waiting for the new Conservative leader, because he is in that post already, Rishi Sunak, to arrive at the party's headquarters just over the road from Parliament. I'm guessing that if Mr Sunak is turning up publicly, he's likely to say something publicly, given that we've not heard from him in public since, in terms of policy anyway, since the leadership election that he lost, the one a few weeks ago. We've not heard him as part of this leadership election either. He will want to, I would have thought, set out some views to the country. You can see just behind Jake Berry there some of the MPs who have been supporting Mr Sunak over the last few days. I could see Nick Gibb there, the former schools minister. Just as I was figuring out who the rest were, we lost that picture there. But look, this is a really significant moment for Rishi Sunak. He thinks that he's been vindicated by what's happened over the last few weeks with the views he expressed over the summer. I'm hearing some cheers there. I wonder if that could be for someone else. I think that's Alex Chalk, the former Solicitor General, being cheered there, one of the ministers who resigned, helping to bring down Boris Johnson a few weeks ago. But you can see there a number of Mr Sunak's supporters gathered, MPs who've been lobbying for him over the last few weeks. Someone a bit stressed there, getting a bit of a massage on their back. I think Alex Chalk was there. It's strange actually, because the Conservative Party's been so febrile. There's a lot of people standing there smiling just now. And you do get a bit of a sense, chatting to Tories on WhatsApp over the past couple of hours, that they feel there's a bit of a weight being lifted from their shoulders. You can see the former Scottish Secretary, David Mundell there, some of Mr Sunak's other backers, all waiting for him to arrive at Conservative HQ in Westminster, presumably to address them. Liam Fox, the former Defence Secretary, in the bottom left there.
And when you say that you're getting a sense that a weight has been lifted off the shoulders, I mean, how important is it potentially for Tory party unity, or at least unity of the MPs, that this has happened in the way that it has, that there hasn't been another divisive contest?
Well, look, I suspect what you'll hear over the next 48 hours is two very different accounts of what's just happened. One will be opposition parties who will say these guys were behind Liz Truss just 7 weeks ago when she became Prime Minister. They backed her and they can't be trusted with the economy now. You'll hear from Mr Sunak and from his allies and from some of the MPs we can see on screen outside Conservative HQ just now. You will hear from them an argument that this is a chance to turn things around and to get things right. I suspect they will try and pass off what's happened over the last few weeks as a bad dream, but that won't be easy, because actually what Mr Sunak is going to have to address when he becomes Prime Minister, probably formally tomorrow, he will have to address an economic situation which most people accept has been made a lot worse by the mini-budget a few weeks ago, by some of the decisions that Liz Truss took. Yes, globally there are big economic challenges which have made it more difficult for the UK economy, but the vast majority of MPs you can see on your screen just now, they would argue that what happened over the last few weeks in here has made things more difficult as well. That's why Liz Truss was forced from office. That's why Rishi Sunak is about to take over in number 10. That's why he faces an enormous challenge over the next few weeks. Really difficult challenges, a daunting entry to try and turn the economy around, to try and persuade the electorate that the Conservatives can still be trusted with the economies. There are many Conservatives who would tell you privately that that's going to be a massive uphill struggle. Opposition parties like Labour will continue to say over the next few days that the Conservatives have lost their reputation for fiscal management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we heard Labour saying they are now the party of fiscal responsibility.
So we wait for Rishi Sunak to arrive at Conservative HQ. It's not very far from Parliament, so he's not got far to go. So hopefully we'll be hearing from him soon. It's just over the road from the Houses of Parliament, behind Methodist Central Church in England. In London. It is, though, for the Conservative Party, a moment where the hope will be, the hope of the people we can see lining the steps there, will be that the party can start to move on and try and turn things around both politically and economically. But both of those things, Joanna, are going to be extremely difficult for the Conservative Party. Politically, because I suspect there will be a lot of people watching at home just now wondering why Mr Sunak can be in this position without a general election. There will be opposition figures who I expect will argue a lot over the next 24 hours that this needs to go to the country now. Economically, it will be challenging as well, because as we've been covering over the last few weeks on BBC News, this is a really testing economic time. A lot of people are facing higher mortgage rates. There's a big decision for the Bank of England next week about how much it's going to put interest rates up by. And there's that massive moment which is due to take place a week today, where the new Chancellor, if it's Jeremy Hunt who remains in that job, we should get confirmation over the next 24 hours. He will set out to the country how he intends to balance the books, and that will mean difficult spending decisions, probably cuts that will be very unpopular, potentially tax rises too.
And in terms of the personnel in this new government, you say that Jeremy Hunt, obviously Chancellor, and it is expected he'll stay, but we don't know, not
but
confirmed.
I think there's a sense that that's likely.
Yeah, what about other figures?
Well, look, I think Rishi Sunak will want his own team in there, so I would expect there to be a lot of changes at the cabinet table. Remember that Liz Truss brought in mostly her allies, her fellow travellers, the ones who agreed with her on her economic direction. Given that Mr Sunak doesn't, I'd expect to see quite a few changes. But I'd also expect to see, given what's happened over the last few weeks with the Conservative Party, given what we've heard Mr Sunak told the 1922 committee just after being elected, I think we're likely to see a slightly more diverse cabinet when it comes to different wings of the Conservative Party than we saw under Liz Truss, and actually than we saw under Boris Johnson when he took over. Some names that potentially could be in line for big jobs are Dominic Raab, the former Deputy Prime Minister, who has been out to bat for Rishi Sunak in the last few days, but did the same even when the going got tough in the last leadership election.
We saw Matt Hancock there. Would he be hoping for a return to government?
I suspect he will be hoping for it. Whether it happens or not will be another question, one that Mr Sunak will be weighing up. One thing I was told by his team this morning is they've not been having conversations with MPs about who would take jobs because they were concentrating so much on the votes today that they just wanted to get that out of the way, and they weren't being presumptuous. But they will be thinking about it. They will be thinking who they want in those top offices of state. In the Chancellor job, do they keep Jeremy Hunt? My hunch is that for stability reasons, that is likely. Who do they want as Home Secretary? Grant Shapps is in there just now, having been there for, what, 4 or 5 days now, but he is a Rishi Sunak backer. I wonder if his campaign might be tempted to keep him there. Will they want to change the Foreign Secretary? It's James Cleverly at the moment, someone who backed Liz Truss in the last leadership election, who backed Boris Johnson in this one, who said this morning that he was now backing Mr Sunak. But there are a lot of names in the mix. There are a lot of allies of Mr Sunak who batted for him over summer, even when it was a bit challenging and it was pretty clear that Liz Truss was going to win. I would have my eye on a lot of them potentially walking up this famous street tomorrow to be given jobs in his top team.
Because you have to be careful about that thing that has been criticised by some within the party about the politicians being promised something to back, in order to favour being carried by promising jobs.
Yes, I think he does have to watch out for that, and I think it's a more complicated picture now because of the need to reunite the Conservative Party. You can see a lot of people standing to attention, which suggests to me that we might be seeing the new Prime Minister-elect arriving at Conservative Party HQ any second. I think that's his car just pulling up. The new Prime Minister likely to be in that car, I think.
Yep, they're walking forward. Looks like it.
And there we are just now. Big cheer, presumably, for Rishi Sunak. There he is, the new Prime Minister, hugging some of his key allies, shaking hands there with the Conservative Chairman, Jake Berry. Alex Chalk, former Solicitor General, getting a hug there as well. Mr Sunak looks like he's going in the door without addressing the public just yet. as we've been talking about all afternoon, this is a strange moment actually where we're seeing the new Prime Minister. We know he's spoken to Conservative MPs behind closed doors, but we've not heard anything from him in the last few days publicly, apart from statements posted on social media. There's a great deal of pressure on him actually to say something. There he is waving to the assembled crowd. A nice photo opportunity for the new Prime Minister. But there is a great deal of pressure, I think, on him now to say something, to tell the nation what he intends to do, what his guiding principles will be, perhaps to deliver a bit more clarity on what his policies will be. We will get some of that from him, I expect, tomorrow, if that's the day that he formally takes over as Prime Minister. As I say, there he is, into Conservative Party HQ.
Very quickly gone in.
No words
and
just yet.
It's a good moment, isn't it, to take stock and think about what will be going through his mind, because as you're saying there is just so much on the agenda. But the fact is, when he lost that leadership contest only 7 weeks ago, he could have been out into the political wilderness for some time. It is extraordinary, and I wonder what he's thinking as so soon after his political fortunes are completely changed and he comes back as Prime Minister. And only over the weekend there was the talk around, whether Boris Johnson wanted to do a deal with him, presumably, again, not to see him coming in as Prime Minister.
I think you're absolutely right. And until early last week, when it became clear that the wheels were falling off on the Truss premiership, Rishi Sunak was out in the political wilderness. He wasn't someone that we expected to make an imminent return to frontline politics. He was deliberately keeping his head down. And from what I understand, his team, when Ms Truss announced her resignation, got going pretty quickly on lobbying MPs, realised that there was a groundswell of support for him, and we saw that this morning. A comfortable majority of MPs had declared publicly that they would back him, so I think he has a decent chance of getting the Conservative Party in Parliament on side. But there is still that wider question: is the Conservative Party membership going to be happy with Mr Sunak? Are they going to be happy with the decisions he makes over the next few weeks? And what about the country? It's 2019 was the general election. That's now, by this time tomorrow, that'll be 2 Prime Ministers ago. It was Boris Johnson who went to the country, promised to get Brexit done, won a majority on that basis. We've had Liz Truss since, the chaotic premiership that ended in disaster. Now we've got Mr Sunak preparing to take over. He will face questions about the mandate he has and whether he can take the country forward. The argument I suspect he will make is that there needs to be stability and there needs to be a bit of time for calm to allow the economy to get back on track. I'm guessing by the fact we're seeing a lectern in Conservative HQ that we are going to hear from Mr Sunak after all at some point. The microphones, I think, are the giveaway there, yes. Joanna. And look, well, this is the moment we were just talking about a few minutes ago. Rishi Sunak's chance to tell the nation, to tell the party membership what he wants to do with power, what his guiding principles will be, how he intends to get the economy back on track, how he intends to help people through the cost of living crisis. A really big moment for a man who a week ago looked like he was going to be in the political wilderness for some time.
Stay with us, we're going to keep an eye on that podium because we did just see him go into that building. We are clearly going to be hearing from him shortly. We'll be back there as soon as he starts to speak, but while we keep an eye on those pictures, let's also get some reaction from outside London. Michelle Kazi is a young South Asian who voted for Rishi Sunak 7 weeks ago in the last Conservative leadership race. Welcome. Well, did you expect that you'd be seeing him as Prime Minister so soon after that leadership contest went in a very different direction?
Well, while I didn't expect it, I must say I am beyond delighted that he is our Prime Minister. He's a very pragmatic Conservative. He knows and understands the economy, and I think he is the right man to tackle inflation and prevent us from going into recession.
I mean, you're obviously happy that it's Rishi Sunak, but what are your thoughts on the fact it didn't go to the wider party vote?
Honestly, I could have seen a wider party vote get quite messy very quickly. In a way, I'm glad that it's been resolved so quickly, because one of the issues was the fact that we don't have
emails for everyone who's a member of the party. Now, there would have been a chance that perhaps thousands would have been excluded from this process. So the MPs resolving it this quickly is a good thing, because that means we don't get those logistical, technical issues of everyone getting a vote.
Does it matter to you that he is the first Prime Minister of colour, the first Prime Minister of Asian descent in this country?
I think it's something to be very proud of. We're a nation of aspiration, and to someone like me, who's a first-generation migrant, it's something that makes me incredibly happy, because this shows that the UK is one of the most welcoming countries in the world for everyone, and Rishi Sunak proves that.
And it is Diwali. When he was Chancellor, he lit Diwali candles outside the door at number 11. He said that was one of the proudest moments, actually, for him of his political career. He can potentially now do that outside number 10.
Yes, for everyone celebrating Diwali, I'd say we now have two reasons to celebrate. One is Diwali itself, and now Rishi being the PM.
He is, of course, though, going to face very difficult challenges facing the people of this country, and people individually having to make very difficult decisions. How difficult do you think that's going to make his premiership?
Well, what he's demonstrated with getting the nominations is showcasing to MPs and members he can unite the parliamentary party. I think that was the first challenge for anyone going into this leadership contest. Now he needs to just make sure he keeps them united, and I think he'll need to make all sides of the party happy when he's appointing his cabinet. So I will be pretty keen to see who is on his cabinet, because one of the mistakes Liz Truss made was she only had her allies in the cabinet. That just means you're opening up grounds for a potential revolt. So I would hope Rishi keeps all sides of the party happy, and then also reaches out to the wider membership as regularly as he can, because at the end of the day, members didn't have a vote, so they do need to be kept happy in this process.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Michelle Kazi. Well, we can talk now to Simon Kidwell, who's Vice President of the National Association of Head Teachers, and that union is warning today that 90% of schools are going to run out of cash next year. It comes obviously with the government facing serious questions about how to fix the black hole in public spending. I think we're talking to Simon Kidwell. Yes, we are talking to Simon Kidwell. So, Simon Kidwell, hello. Thank you for joining us. In terms of your concerns around what's happening with funding for schools, how worried are you?
We're incredibly worried at school because we are facing a black hole in the finances. In the 2019 manifesto, the Conservative government promised an uplift in funding that would restore real terms funding back to 2010 levels, and we were encouraged by the amount invested in education. However, we're now facing a £2 billion shortfall in that amount, which is equivalent to 38,000 teachers. So I am encouraged. I heard from Miriam Cates earlier on BBC News saying that Rishi Sunak was going to unite the party by returning to 2019 manifesto promises, and I'd urge him to make sure that education promised in 2019 is prioritised.
Has that already, though, been superseded in terms of what's happening with inflation?
I think the challenge is that schools faced real-term cuts throughout the last decade of 9%. That was then restored, to be restored by the end of this Parliament. So we're looking at a 3% cut in real terms funding by the end of this Parliament. If you look at private schools, they've had a 24% uplift in their real terms funding. So schools have no where to go apart from either making mass staff redundancies or increasing class sizes. We really are in a challenging position in schools.
Simon Kidwell, thank you for joining us. Well, how would you describe Rishi Sunak in one word? Savanta Comres, a polling research company, came up with a word cloud and people sent in their thoughts. And this is the conclusion. Rich is the overwhelming word alongside capable, OK, good and clever. Chris Hopkins is Political Research Director at Savanta Comres, and he joins us live from Colchester. Welcome. So some words that people associate with Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Rich is going to grab the headlines here. Ultimately, it is the most eye-catching word on the page. But I think it's really important to remember that this is, when we ask these about almost any leader or any candidate that we've asked them about previously, it's rarely this good. The fact that capable, okay, good, clever, smart are all very, very readable on this image is really important, and actually, a pretty good sign, a pretty good start for Rishi Sunak. I think the concern, obviously, is what the largest word is, and given the economic outlook that the UK faces at the moment, ultimately Rishi Sunak may well be seen to be slightly out of touch. Obviously, he is a very wealthy. It's well documented how wealthy he is, and whether he is therefore the person to lead Britain through troubling economic times when so many will struggle, that does remain to be seen. But yeah, I guess in that sense, it's not the greatest word to be dominating this word cloud.
He's got the leadership through effectively a coronation. How important do you think that is going to be?
I mean, I think generally speaking, the public are not that impressed. They weren't that impressed when Liz Truss came to power that way. But ultimately, it does happen increasingly a lot. And the UK is a parliamentary democracy. Therefore, this can happen. We do see in our polling, we have done for quite a while now, especially since Liz Truss became Prime Minister. But I'm sure calls will intensify now. Now, given that a second Prime Minister has been coronated, so to speak, without a general election, I'm sure calls for an election will increase. But ultimately, for Conservative MPs at the moment, given how far behind they are in the polls, that would be like turkeys voting for Christmas. And I think Rishi Sunak has already ruled out an immediate general election today. So yeah, I don't think the calls for that, however intense they get, are likely to come true.
Chris Hopkins, thank you. Let's go to our correspondent, Helen Catt. She is in Central Lobby in the Houses of Parliament. Helen.
Hi, yeah, lots of MPs have been milling around here for the last couple of hours giving their reactions. The talk is all of unity and how the party can move forward. Of course, that's going to be a challenge. We've seen quite a lot of division over the last few months over that summer leadership contest. Now we've got the man who lost that now in charge. So that's going to be quite a shift for the party to get behind. Now, those I've spoken to in Central Lobby have said that, yes, they think that can be done. I was speaking earlier to Miriam Cates, as you saw, and she was saying she's the MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge, and she was saying that she felt a lot of the disagreement had been about personalities rather than policies. But of course, policies is going to be a key thing too, isn't it? And we're going to have to find out in the coming days what Rishi Sunak's policy platform is.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. Let's go to Northamptonshire and our news correspondent,
when we've got
Joe Black. No, we don't have Joe. Let's bring in us here in Downing Street. We're waiting to hear from. Sorry, it's a bit of a whirl, isn't it? There's so much going on, and we are expecting to. Yes, we're expecting to hear from Rishi Sunak shortly.
Yeah, we're going to hear from him in Conservative H quarters in Westminster. I'm expecting a statement from the Prime Minister-elect about his plans for office, his big guiding principles. I don't think there are any journalists in there, so I wouldn't expect there to be any questions when we hear from Mr Sunak at that podium in the next few minutes' time. But look, as we've been talking about all afternoon, it's a big moment because this hasn't been the normal campaign where ideas are tested, where there's a bit of a debate about what the right policies are. We had that over the summer, and Mr Sunak was part of that, so we know a bit about what he wants to do. But a lot of the economic situation since then has changed. Clearly, it's got worse. Clearly, there are going to have to be harder decisions made. And the big question for Mr Sunak when he addresses the nation for the first time since being elected Conservative leader and Prime Minister-elect is, does he level with the public and just say, look, the next few months are going to be hard. We're going to have to make some difficult decisions. That's exactly the message coming out of the Treasury, so I would expect Mr Sunak, as a former Chancellor, to know that picture and to feel the need to deliver a similar sort of statement. But it is a big moment for him politically, that he needs to tell us all what he wants to do with power.
And of course, Liz Truss remains in Downing Street behind us. But away from the cameras. We won't presumably see anything from her until we have that moment when she goes to see the King, and we don't know currently when that will be.
I think that's right. We will probably see that tomorrow. My understanding is the logistics of getting it done today are just too much, so we're not going to see that transition moment today, but we are likely to see it happen tomorrow. Mr Sunak is spending the afternoon, as we're seeing just now, at Conservative H quarters in central London, where he's meeting his supporters and speaking to them, and he's about to address the nation for the first time as Conservative leader. But I mean, tomorrow is the moment, the kind of history moment, where Rishi Sunak will formally become Prime Minister, where we will see Liz Truss walk out of number 10 for the first time as the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history. She will try and put a brave face on it and say, here's what I think we've done in power. She tried that last week where she talked about reducing national insurance. That's about it, really. She will then go to see the King, and for the first time he will be at the centre of that process, where he will welcome Liz Truss, accept her resignation, then invite Rishi Sunak to form a new government. He will then come back here to Downing Street and make that address to the country from outside number 10. But as we can see at the moment, he is in Westminster, just opposite the Houses of Parliament, where his supporters have been gathering. You can see some of them on screen now, clapping away, clearly very happy that their man has got the top job. He is in that building at the moment, and we're about to hear him speak to the country for the first time in quite a few weeks, actually. He's done a couple of events in Parliament, very low-key events where he, in theory, has spoken publicly, but we've not really heard him talk about the big political issues of the day, the big economic challenges the country is facing on screen since he was beaten by Liz Truss 7 weeks ago today.
He's a very well-known Chancellor, not least because of what happened during the pandemic, but it's easy to forget then that he has been in politics actually for very little time, and Chancellor, his first and only cabinet position for 2 years, and now Prime Minister.
Well, look, his rise was meteoric. He took over from William Hague in the seat he still occupies, and you'll remember that it was part of the chaos of an earlier era that led to Mr Sunak becoming Chancellor. It was Sajid Javid had just become Boris Johnson's first Chancellor. A few weeks into the job, he was told, Mr Javid, that he couldn't keep his own aides. He quit. Mr Sunak came in as Chancellor, and within weeks was facing the turmoil of the pandemic, that extraordinary intervention that Mr Sunak had to oversee, the furlough scheme, the business support, hundreds of billions of pounds spent on propping up the British economy at a time of crisis in the health world. Well, now Mr Sunak is about to take over in number 10 at a time of crisis in the economy, and he is facing probably a similar sort of level of challenge when it comes to getting inflation under control, getting government spending under control, trying to fill the fiscal black hole, and trying to help millions of people across the country who are struggling with the cost of living crisis. His entry is daunting, and he faces big challenges as Prime Minister.
Thank you, Nick. Well, let's go to Northamptonshire and our news correspondent, Joe Black in Corby. Joe.
Hi, yes, we've been talking to voters here in Corby in Northamptonshire, which is 90 miles away from where you are in Westminster, talking to them about the fact that Rishi Sunak is the new Prime Minister. I have to say, not many people were surprised, but some people said, you know, that's just the way it is. That's just politics. So we asked them what they wanted from their new Prime Minister. You won't be surprised to learn that lots of them wanted him to focus on the economy. Cost of living was another one. Someone said to me, we spoke to a young teacher who was in his 20s. He said he can't afford a mortgage. Friends of his can't afford a mortgage. He doesn't know what he's going to do when his friend moves out of his rented property. So cost of living, living places really, really on people's minds around here. Spoke to one lady who said she just wanted stability. She talked about how she was retired and she had investments and she wanted Rishi to look after the economy because of that. She said working people have got these investments, so that's what she wanted him to focus on. She wanted him to bring the party together. Stability, a big word around here. Also been struck by how many people here are fans of Boris Johnson. Lots of them have told me that they're very disappointed that he stepped away from the contest. And also, it might not surprise you, lots of people around here still calling for a general election.
Thank you very much, Joe. Well, that is something that Rishi Sunak has said will not be happening. But in order for it not to happen, there needs to be political unity, political stability. And he's been speaking to his Tory MPs in private. We're expecting to hear from him speaking in front of the cameras. He went into Conservative Party headquarters just a little bit earlier. He didn't speak on camera. We saw him go into the building fairly quickly, but there was a throng of his supporters outside, and there was lots of cheering and handshaking. No words in front of the cameras, but we are expecting to hear from him shortly. Nick Eardley here with me in Downing Street as we await that, Nick. And it is going to be obviously the first time that we hear him speak since being declared Prime Minister, unchallenged. Well, there was the challenge, but didn't go to the vote in the end. How much detail would you expect him to give?
Not much. I don't think he'll go into specific policies. I think this will be a broad outline, a thanks to his campaign probably, a bit of a message to the Conservative Party and a message to the country saying these are the broad principles that will guide his politics. It's normally that moment here in Downing Street where a Prime Minister outlines a bit more of their big grand vision for power. But my sense is that what Mr Sunak has to say will be dictated by the economy, will be dictated by what's happened with the cost of living crisis rather than any grand vision of broader political ambition. Mr Sunak will know that people are worried about the economic climate. He will know how close to the breadline a lot of households are at the moment, and I suspect that's something that he will feel that he has to address over the next few minutes. It will be a statement, is my understanding. I'm not expecting any questions from journalists, so the scrutiny of his policies may have to wait for today. But this is his first moment as Conservative leader to stand up to the nation and say, here's what I want to do. And it will be tomorrow, I expect. I don't think it's been formally confirmed just yet, but I would expect it to be tomorrow that we get the transition of power here, where Liz Truss leaves for the last time and the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, arrives back in Downing Street. Remember, it's only a few weeks ago that he lived in number 11, not that long ago that he resigned from Boris Johnson's government, but he'll be moving into number 10 for the first time. But shortly, we're expecting a slightly ominous black screen just come up there, but shortly we are expecting Rishi Sunak to make his first comments, in public anyway, since he became the Prime Minister-elect.
And, I mean, you talk obviously about the in-tray. There are, in terms of the challenges, there are always challenges, obviously, for any Prime Minister, but in terms of how much they stack up right now, it's a particularly difficult time, isn't it? Because it's the problems with the country, with those choices to be taken on how to provide support for people when the economy is already shrinking, the need to cut public spending, and then juggling, of course, the internal politics of it all.
It's a colossal challenge. I think we have a rough idea from the summer of Rishi Sunak's sort of guiding principles. So he wants to bring inflation down. He wants to try and keep the economy growing, but without taking radical decisions like Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did. But he's also made it pretty clear in his previous statements, we'll see if these hold over the next few days, that he wants interventions to be targeted. He doesn't want to do what Liz Truss did when she came in, which is throw money at a problem. She looked at that energy issue, the cost of energy, and said, we need to have a medium-term solution. She offered to cap the price of energy, the unit price, for 2 years. Well, that fell apart, and the new Chancellor ripped that up. That guarantee is only there for 6 months now. But Mr. Sunak has made it pretty clear that he wants to prioritise those he believes are more vulnerable, and that could mean, we don't know for sure yet, let's see what he says, but that could mean that some on better incomes are facing higher bills in the next few months.
The calls won't go away from opposition politicians, obviously, of the need, they say, for a general election. Rishi Sunak has said that there won't be one. What would you say are the prospects now of whether there is an earlier election? Have they receded a bit by the fact that he has come in the way that he's come in, with the party uniting behind him?
I think they're low for the simple reason that you need Conservative MPs to back it, and at the moment it would be a lot like turkeys voting for Christmas, because all the polls suggest that the Conservatives would get hammered if there was a general election tomorrow. We are going to see a lot of people over the next few days saying, you know, that there needs to be a general election as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. That's the view of the Labour Party, it's the view of the Liberal Democrats, it's the view of the SNP, it's the view of some Conservatives as well. Nadine Dorries, the former Culture Secretary, among those Johnson allies, who have said that they now think there needs to be a general election. Mm-hmm. But I am fairly confident that Mr. Sunak will want to try and hold that off for a while. He'll make the argument, I suspect, that you need some stability after all the economic turmoil of the last few weeks. But he will face a lot of pressure.
Yeah, let me just say that Liz Truss's spokesperson has confirmed that the handover definitely will not be happening today. So as expected. So that moment when Liz Truss goes to the King, formally resigns, the King asks Rishi Sunak to form the next government, none of that is going to be happening today.
My money's still on tomorrow, for the simple reason that I suspect Liz Truss will want to get this over and done with as soon as possible. I suspect she won't want to do Prime Minister's questions, for example, on Wednesday, and Mr. Sunak will want to get his feet under the table as quickly as possible and start appointing his cabinet, deciding who he wants around the top table in his team. My hunch is that he will want that to be as widespread from the party as possible. He'll want to bring in those different wings after all those calls for unity. And he will want to do Prime Minister's questions, I suspect, on Wednesday. So use what we're about to hear in a couple of minutes' time to set out his vision to his party and to start talking to the country, to use the Downing Street moment tomorrow to tell us all what his guiding principles as Prime Minister will be. Undoubtedly, they will be shaped by the state of the economy and the cost of living crisis. And then on Wednesday, he'll want to face Sir Keir Starmer at the dispatch box at Prime Minister's questions for the very first time.
I think we're about a minute away from hearing from Rishi Sunak. And it's not likely he's going to give us a huge amount of detail, is it? But just a sense of direction.
We've got quite a lot of precedent for these takeover day speeches in the last few years, don't we? We've heard them from Liz Truss, Boris Johnson and Theresa May. They tend, just after they win the Conservative leadership, to be fairly short, maybe about 5 minutes, setting out a thanks to the party, thanking their team, maybe some guiding principles, no detail on policy. Anything like that is more likely over the next few days. You'll get more of that tomorrow. But Mr. Sunak will also have to sit around the table with his Chancellor and figure out what the state of the economy is. It's a few weeks now since Mr. Sunak's been in the Treasury. He won't know the exact state of the public finances. We know he's spoken to Jeremy Hunt over the weekend, the current Chancellor, about what needs to happen. But he will want to get on his feet under the desk, to sit down, to work out what's going on with OBR projections, that's the independent projections of the Office of Budget Responsibility, and take it from there.
So what we were told earlier, or at least what Liz Truss's spokesperson was saying to reporters, is that the work continues on that fiscal statement. How much is effectively drawn up? How much of a stamp is Rishi Sunak going to be able to put on it with very little time to actually effect change? And as you say, so much that he's got to get up to speed up with.
It's a really good question. It's a week today. The plan is still, the working plan in the Treasury is still a week today, on the 31st of October. I think Mr Sunak will be guided by or be dictated to by the events of the last few weeks, the state of the public finances, some of the decisions that the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has already made. But he will want to rubber stamp those decisions. He will want to sit around with the Chancellor to discuss the decisions that have been made, maybe change some of them, maybe some things might require a rethink, maybe the political imperatives that Mr Sunak has will be slightly different from Ms Sunak. So he will want to sit around the table to work out what those principles are with his new Chancellor before signing off on those plans. I suppose the fact that this is done and dusted today rather than Friday gives them a bit more leeway to sit around and to figure out with the Chancellor what those priorities should be. If it had been Friday, it would have been very quick. He wouldn't have had much time at all to figure out what he wanted to do. But I think that will be absolutely one of the key priorities for Rishi Sunak, working out the economic priorities, the things that have to happen to balance the public books. I don't think the message will change. The decisions are going to be hard. There are going to be spending cuts. There are going to be spending squeezes. There may well be tax rises. That's what Jeremy Hunt is working on at the moment. But Mr Sunak will want to give that his seal of approval.
How much difference now is there between the Tories and the Labour Party? There was a huge gap under Truss and Trussonomics, but that's gone.
Well, look, I mean, let's see exactly what Mr Sunak decides on. I think that both parties agree that growth is the priority. They both talk about it till they're blue in the face at the moment. There have been very different strategies about what to do next. Labour continue to say, for example, that you should extend the windfall tax on oil and gas companies that are making record profits and say to them, you need to cough up more of that profit in tax. Here's Mr Sunak now, let me hand over.
I'd like to pay tribute to Liz Truss for her dedicated public service to the country. She has led with dignity and grace through a time of great change and under exceptionally difficult circumstances, both at home and abroad. I am humbled and honoured to have the support of my parliamentary colleagues and to be elected as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. It is the greatest privilege of my life to be able to serve the party I love and give back to the country I owe so much to. The United Kingdom is a great country, but there is no doubt we face a profound economic challenge. We now need stability and unity, and I will make it my utmost priority to bring our party and our country together, because that is the only way we will overcome the challenges we face and build a better, more prosperous future for our children and our grandchildren. I pledge that I will serve you with integrity and humility, and I will work day in, day out to deliver for the British people.
Well, that was short, as you predicted it might be, Nick. The greatest privilege of his life to be serving as Prime Minister. He said we now need stability and unity. He said my utmost priority is to bring our country together, and I will serve you with integrity and humility. What did you make of that?
Well, look, as we thought, Rishi Sunak has set out the basic challenge that he is going to face in Downing Street, that profound economic challenge that he talked about, inflation, the challenges for the public purse, somehow managing to fill the fiscal black hole that we know exists of about 30 to 40 billion pounds at the moment, to try and keep the economic markets, the financial markets I should say, calm. Now, we heard him talk about stability and unity. I think that's code for no general election. He wants to try and get on with the job and to try and get the car back on the road. It's going to be tough. There was no suggestion there as we thought about how he might do it, about how he will tackle some of the difficult decisions that are going to have to be made over the next few weeks. So what we've just had is a brief summary of what Rishi Sunak's guiding principles will be, tackling that profound economic challenge, stability and unity, promising humility and integrity in number 10. But exactly how he's going to do that, how he's going to pursue and to tackle some of those profound economic challenges he talks of, we still wait for those details.
Thank you very much, Nick. Well, let's talk then to Bridget Phillipson for Labour. Welcome. We have a new Prime Minister anointed, and he is talking about the need for stability and unity. Does the fact that he has come in with the support of his party mean that we are going to be heading for a more stable and united time in terms of the government?
I sadly don't think so, and the only way we're going to get any kind of stability is through securing a Labour government and a general election. It isn't right that this has just been Conservative MPs who've been able to have their say. I think the British people should be able to have their say in a general election. There's no mandate for any of this.
Why do you say that an election will be the best way forward for stability? Wouldn't it mean more instability, at least in the short term?
Because it's these last 12 years under the Conservatives that have got us to the position that we're in now, where people can't get a GP appointment, where parents are forced out of work because of childcare pressures, and where victims of crime aren't getting justice. It's only a Labour government that will give us that fresh start, that will put our country on a more stable footing, and will address all of the challenges that we face as a country. Rishi Sunak has no mandate for any of this, and it's only right that the British people have a proper say in who's responsible for governing their country.
We don't know, though, because Labour haven't spelled out exactly what a Labour government would mean. What would you do? What would your manifesto promises be in terms of the spending commitments or spending cuts and tax rises or tax cuts?
We're not short of things to say where it comes to the changes that we need to see in our country and how we build a fairer, greener Britain. So that's business rates. We think that system needs to change, about creating well-paid, highly skilled jobs in every corner of our country and making that shift around energy. And where it comes to schools, where I'm responsible for education for Labour, we would end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, and we put that money into delivering a brilliant state education for all of our children. Of course, we'd set out a full manifesto in the event of a general election, but we have set out the clear difference between a Labour government and a Conservative government.
The sorts of things that you're talking about there, though, cutting business rates, giving state schools money effectively raised by private school education, they're small areas, aren't they? And the situation in terms of the bigger economic picture for the government is a £40 billion spending black hole. How would Labour fix that?
The only reason that we're even having this conversation about spending cuts, and we weren't talking about this a month ago, is because the Conservatives have crashed the economy. It's a Conservative crisis made in Downing Street, but it's the British people who are set to pay the price. And we will be making different choices about ending non-dom status, about ending the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, a windfall tax on oil and gas producers who've got more money than they know what to do with. But this does come down to the mismanagement of the economy, the reckless approach that the Conservatives have taken. Labour would be responsible where it comes to the public finances. We'd make sure we get value for money. Unlike Rishi Sunak, who presided over industrial scale levels of fraud and waste when he was Chancellor during the pandemic and made no effort to claw any of that money back.
Bridget Phillipson for Labour, thank you very much. Well, let's go to our correspondent Helen Catt, who's in Central Lobby in the Palace of Westminster. Helen.
Hi, I am, and I've got with me someone who's just hot-footed it back, actually, from Conservative Party headquarters, Dr. Willcox, the MP for North Somerset. What was the atmosphere like? You watched the speech. What did you make of it?
Well, it was as his speech was to MPs an hour earlier. It was clear, it was concise, it wasn't flash, it was very businesslike. And I think that's very much what we can expect to see from Rishi Sunak, somebody who's very calm, very confident, and competent. And I think those are three things that the party is very keen to see, as of course the country will be.
You say not flashy, but some people might listen to that and think a bit boring.
I think it wasn't boring. It was very clear to the point about what was needed to be done. And I think that he's not someone who pretends that there are simple answers to complex questions. And I think people will warm to that, to someone who tells them as it is, doesn't dress it up. And I think that's the sort of quiet, competent government that frankly, we need to see.
You backed him in the summer. How surprising is it for you to see him walk through the door as the Conservative leader and become the Prime Minister, having in effect been, out of it really about 6 weeks ago?
Well, I think it's very good. I'm delighted for him. I'm delighted for the Conservative Party, and I'm delighted for the country. I think that we will all gain from that steady competence which I've seen him display. And people remember that in the pandemic, his furlough scheme kept numerous businesses afloat and lots of jobs still in existence. Had we not done that, it's difficult to know how we'd be facing the global turbulence if we'd much higher unemployment and far few businesses trading. So a lot of people will remember his judgment as being very effective, something the IMF said was one of the best schemes in the world.
He's walking into a situation now which is much worse than it would have been had he been elected leader at the end of the last leadership contest. How can he turn this around for the economy?
Well, the first thing to do is to give confidence to the international markets. I think we've already seen a very calm reaction there. They've taken the news well. I think that he needs to ensure that as interest rates rise around the world, which they are doing as a result of global inflation, as the United States Federal Reserve raise their interest rates, it will drive our interest rates up. And I think the aim there will be that we don't have to have any higher interest rate rises than necessary. In other words, we maintain the market confidence, therefore they don't charge a higher premium for lending to the United Kingdom. I think that the fact that he has been the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the fact that he is very au fait with all the economic issues, will actually stand us in good stead.
Are we likely to see a reversal of some of those policies which moved quite a long way away from the 29 manifesto? Like, for example, are we likely to see him reinstate the moratorium on fracking?
Well, we'll get all these as we go through the next few days, but I think the direction of travel is very clear, that he's a very traditional Conservative in the sense that he believes in sound money, that the government shouldn't be spending what it doesn't have, it shouldn't be passing on that debt to future generations, and that we have to cut our cloth accordingly. And I think that's, he wants to see lower taxes, but like Mrs. Thatcher and other leaders before him, believes that those tax cuts have to be earned and not borrowed for. And that, I think, is one thing that will make the financial markets much calmer.
Dr. Willcox, thank you very much. So that's the view of one very pleased Sunak supporter, I think it's fair to say. We've been speaking to people as they come through Central Lobby here in Parliament all afternoon, and the words that keep coming up time and again, though, are unity and stability, just as Rishi Sunak said in his speech.
Thank you very much, Helen. Well, let's take a closer look then at our next Prime Minister. The former Chancellor Rishi Sunak had been the favourite to succeed his old boss Boris Johnson as Prime Minister after he resigned in July. But he failed to persuade Tory members, who ultimately put Liz Truss in Downing Street in September. Rishi Sunak, who has not commented on the recent turmoil, said he was standing as Prime Minister to fix a profound economic crisis, as well as to unite his party. He became Chancellor in February 2020 and within weeks found himself having to steer the UK economy as the pandemic and its lockdowns began. In April, the finances of Rishi Sunak and his family came under intense scrutiny, with the tax affairs of his heiress wife, Akshata Murthy, placed in the spotlight. She later announced she would start paying UK tax on her overseas earnings to relieve political pressure on her husband. Rishi Sunak is a practicing Hindu and he becomes the first Asian Prime Minister. And he said when he spoke just a short while ago, becoming Prime Minister is the greatest privilege of my life. We now need stability and unity, and my utmost priority is to bring our country together. Well, let's bring in Tim Bale, a Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Welcome, thank you for joining us. Your thoughts?
Well, I think, to be honest, that once Boris Johnson withdrew, this was inevitable. I think it's the best result possible, really, for the Conservative Party. I don't think they wanted to put the country through another membership vote, particularly when that membership is so unrepresentative. And it does mean, as your correspondent was saying earlier, that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have a little bit more time to put together that all-important financial statement, which hopefully will calm the markets even further than Hunt has already managed to do.
Do you think we might be in for a slightly more boring, a slightly quieter time in politics?
I'm sure actually most members of the public would quite like that. I thought it was interesting that Rishi Sunak in his speech also mentioned the word integrity. He didn't talk about Boris Johnson, but I suspect that the subliminal message was pretty clear to most people. I think he will hope to run a completely different and far less chaotic administration to the one that his former boss did. It will be interesting to see if there's any role in that for Johnson. I very much doubt it. But of course, that does create a slight problem. If you've got Boris Johnson on the backbenches and you're under pressure, that might be a little bit difficult for a new Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, who's on the backbenches, as you mentioned. I mean, obviously Boris Johnson, Prime Minister until not very long ago. Liz Truss also Prime Minister not very long ago. Theresa May also. I mean, there have been 5 Prime Ministers in 6 years, 5 Conservative Prime Ministers in 6 years, and that's only the Prime Ministers we're talking about. Lots of other key personnel who have gone from high-profile positions to being backbenchers.
Well, I mean, it might be the case that Rishi Sunak will bring some of them back, actually, because I think, one of the key things he'll want to do is to coin the cliche, bring in all the talents. One of the problems he will have, however, is that because there was so much churn and turnover, particularly under Boris Johnson, there will be a lot of people who were brought onto the front bench by Johnson and to some extent by Truss, who may well, as a result, be let go. Now, whether they will allow their resentment to fuel rebellion against Rishi Sunak will be interesting to see. I suspect if he can offer them some prospect of saving their seats, they might keep quiet, but you never know.
And the polling indicates that, even when it was a case of which of the different contenders for leader might do best in the country or best against Keir Starmer as Labour leader, none of them were on course to win an election. So if the Tories potentially have 2 years to try to deliver unity, try to deliver some sort of stability, could their fortunes change?
Well, they could change. I mean, we have an example from fairly recent history where a Tory Prime Minister took over from an incredibly unpopular predecessor in the middle of a very difficult economic period and yet managed to win an election. And that was John Major, who took over from Thatcher in 1990 and managed to squeeze a win in 1992. So a win for Labour isn't completely inevitable. And you have to remember, of course, that Labour was a long way behind in 2019. However, having said that, it looks to me, and I think to most people who follow these things closely, like the public has probably made up its mind about the Conservatives now, and it's a case really of just limiting the damage.
Thank you very much, Tim Bale. Well, let's hear again what Rishi Sunak said earlier when he spoke on camera briefly, but his first words since becoming Prime Minister.
I'd like to pay tribute to Liz Truss for her dedicated public service to the country. She has led with dignity and grace through a time of great change and under exceptionally difficult circumstances, both at home and abroad. I am humbled and honoured to have the support of my parliamentary colleagues and to be elected as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. It is the greatest privilege of my life to be able to serve the party I love and give back to the country I owe so much to. The United Kingdom is a great country, but there is no doubt we face a profound economic challenge. We now need stability and unity, and I will make it my utmost priority to bring our party and our country together, because that is the only way we will overcome the challenges we face and build a better, more prosperous future for our children and our grandchildren. I pledge that I will serve you with integrity and humility, and I will work day in, day out to deliver for the British people.
Rishi Sunak with those first comments in front of the cameras since he was anointed as leader of the Tory party and the next Prime Minister. And Liz Truss's spokesperson has confirmed that there will not be a formal handover of power today. It's expected it'll be tomorrow, but we've not had any details on what and when the choreography will be. Well, let's go to Sundar Katwala. He's the director of British Future think tank and the former General Secretary of the Labour-affiliated Fabian Society. His family roots trace Indian and Irish heritage. Welcome, thank you for joining us. Your thoughts then on Rishi Sunak being anointed as the new Prime Minister?
Well, I think it's a historic moment in British social history to have the first post-war ethnic minority Prime Minister, the first British Indian, British Asian Prime Minister, and the first practicing non-Christian Prime Minister in the country's history, because Rishi Sunak's a Hindu. And I think that's an important change in British society. People will say those are not the most important things, because what really matters is, can he get a grip on the government, on the economic plan, and that's people will judge him as they would judge any Prime Minister. But this wouldn't have been possible 10 or 20 years ago. And so I think it is a gradual progression in British society that ethnic diversity, people serving from every colour and creed, is part of the top table of politics now. And I think everybody should welcome that.
Mm-hmm. In terms of what you want to hear from him as Prime Minister, what would that be?
Well, he's got the hardest inheritance of any peacetime Prime Minister. So people will be looking for calm and stability. They know he's got to fix the public finances, but they'll be worried about the impact on the public services. On broader issues of identity, culture, the so-called culture wars we've been having, I hope he'll call those off, really, and say we haven't really got time for those kinds of divisive and polarising debates. We've had a lot of division in our politics, and I hope we'll move on. There'll be pressure from within his party, from the right, from across the parties, to have those clashes too. But his instincts, I think, are to try and, be unifying at a very, very difficult time. There's no doubt the economics of this moment are incredibly hard, but I hope we'll see an attempt at professional integrity in politics, and not too much party politics, really. I know that he's got a general election to think about. He's got a very difficult job in that general election. I hope he'll be the Prime Minister before he tries to be a party leader.
Thank you for joining us, Sundar Katwala. Well, let's take a look at reactions across the nations. In a moment, we'll talk to James Shaw in Glasgow and Hal Griffith in Cardiff, but first to Chris Page in Belfast.
Well, Joanna, the big question hanging over politics here in Northern Ireland is, will there be an election to the Stormont Assembly this side of Christmas? And the events in Westminster have, of course, added a huge degree of uncertainty to that. As things stand, the current Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, has said he is planning to call an election this Friday. That is when the deadline for the restoration of the devolved government here runs out. The Democratic Unionist Party are currently refusing to join in a power-sharing coalition and therefore blocking the formation of devolved government at all over their opposition to the Brexit trade border in the Irish Sea known as the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the DUP says it won't change position as long as checks on goods arriving here from Great Britain continue. The DUP leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, has this afternoon congratulated Rishi Sunak. He has also said that Mr Sunak needs to bear in mind that the protocol is polluting, in his words, every area of government in this part of the UK, and that the operation of devolution in Northern Ireland is incompatible as long as the protocol still exists. Sinn Féin, who replaced the DUP as the largest party here at Stormont in Assembly elections in May, they say they were really indifferent as to who took over at the top of the Tory party and as head of government in London, but they have said Mr Sunak should be prioritising working to restore devolution here. So that is one of the big challenges facing the new Prime Minister. How do you restore power sharing at Stormont? Always a fragile affair, and now that the impasse has lasted for 9 long months. The question this week, will Mr Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, still be in his job come Friday? Friday to call that election, as he has said that he will, or will there be a cabinet reshuffle? He could be replaced by somebody who, for example, has different ideas. Worth noting, though, that the junior minister in the Northern Ireland office, Steve Baker, has today said that regardless as to whether there's a cabinet reshuffle, that government policy is that an election will be called on Friday because, in the government's view, that is what the legislation governing Stormont says must happen. So that's the picture here in Northern Ireland. Now over to my colleague James Shaw in Scotland.
Been a congratulatory message from the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Of course, there are huge political differences between the SNP in Scotland and the Conservatives at Westminster. So Nicola Sturgeon says, notwithstanding the political differences, I will do my best to build a constructive working relationship with Rishi Sunak in the interests of the people that we serve. She also points out that he is the first British Asian to be Prime Minister, and she says that is a genuinely significant moment. But she urges him in terms of the economic and fiscal policy of the Conservative government not to go for another round of austerity. That is the fear that there will be extreme cuts to public services in Scotland as a result of the money that needs to be saved to deal with the fiscal deficit that the UK government has. She urges Rishi Sunak not to take that approach, but instead to call for a general election. Now, the leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, Douglas Ross, he has said that he believes Rishi Sunak has the experience, because he has been Chancellor of the Exchequer, to deal with what he calls the tough economic circumstances. He says he thinks that Mr. Sunak will be able to navigate those conditions that we face at the moment. Now, Rishi Sunak has gone on the record in the past in terms of how he is going to approach relations between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. He's made it very clear. He did that during campaigning with Liz Truss, during that leadership contest in the summer, that he is absolutely against a second independence referendum. He said it would be, as he put it, frankly balmy to have another vote during a cost of living crisis. And we also, I think, can expect him to look quite closely at what the Scottish Government does, at the policies it's pursued and its record in things like health and education and drugs policy. I think what he wants to be able to do is look at the SNP's record in government and compare it to the UK government. And I think he expects by doing that he will be calling the SNP to account, and he would hope exposing failures, as he would see it, in their 15 years of government in Scotland. And now to my colleague Howell Griffith in Cardiff.
Thanks, James. Yeah, well, we've also just had the reaction of Wales's First Minister, Mark Drakeford, the leader of the Labour Party here at the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, tweeting llongyfarchiadau, or congratulations to Rishi Sunak, and goes on to say the UK desperately needs a period of stability. I hope we're able to work together constructively to support people through these difficult times in a way that your predecessors didn't allow. That's a none too subtle swipe at both Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. It's fair to say there's been quite a lot of discord between Cardiff Bay and Westminster over the last 3 years or so. Mark Drakeford hasn't had a phone call yet from Liz Truss since she took control, and probably not likely to now. So will he expect a call from Rishi Sunak? Will that relationship between the Prime Minister and First Minister of Wales be reset? They are, of course, from difficult political parties, but they both have joint problems to tackle, not least the cost of living crisis. Rishi Sunak, when he was here in Cardiff for the hustings in the summer, said he'd be questioning and scrutinising the Welsh Labour government's time, well, more than 2 decades now in power here in Wales, looking at the record on the NHS and asking why, in his view, patients here weren't able to have an equitable service or performance from the NHS. Also looking at spending in education. We have seen from previous Tory leaders this idea that Wales is somewhere they can reflect on if they want to look for Labour weaknesses. So If and when we do eventually come to a general election, will that be a tactic that Rishi Sunak deploys? He can expect a rather more cordial relationship with the Welsh Tories. The leader of the Welsh Conservatives, Andrew R.T. Davies, congratulating him, saying he sees him as a friend of Wales. And it's fair to say, well, within hours before the result at lunchtime, most of the Welsh Tory MPs were backing Rishi Sunak. A few have tiptoed in and out of different camps over the course of the summer. He will want them all now to be on side so they can work together and try and bring back some unity to their party. Joanna, back to you.
Thank you very much, Hal. So that's some of the reaction from the nations. We, of course, now have a new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and he's spoken briefly on camera. He said, "It is the greatest privilege of my life." He said, "We now need stability and unity, and my utmost priority will be to bring our country together." There won't be an official handover of power today. Liz Truss remains at Downing Street, but there will, of course, be that moment when they go to the King, when the King asks Rishi Sunak to form the next government. It will not be happening today. It's expected it will be tomorrow, but we don't have any confirmed details on that. Much more from here at Downing Street shortly, but right now back to Jane in the studio.
Joanna, thank you very much. A very good afternoon to you. You are still watching BBC News. The time now 23 minutes before 5. And we are, of course, as you would expect, very much going to stay with our coverage of the news that the country has a new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, 42 years old Prime Minister, the youngest Prime Minister for more than 200 years. We are going to discuss the many, many things in the new Prime Minister's in tray. And let's start with economics, but specifically really with business. Let's discuss all of that with Lord Billamoria, who I'm pleased to say joins me this afternoon, Vice President of the business organisation, the CBI. You might know he is the founder of Cobra Beer and sits as an independent crossbench peer in the House of Lords. Very good afternoon to you, Lord Billamoria. Your thoughts on Rishi Sunak now as the new Prime Minister?
Well, in 2002, I was privileged to be awarded Asian of the Year by David Blunkett, then Home Secretary. And in my acceptance speech, I said, in my lifetime, we will see an Asian as Prime Minister of this country. It's taken 2 decades, but we've got there. And Rishi Sunak is Prime Minister. This is wonderful news, not just for the Asian community, not just for the South Asian community here in the UK, but for the Indian community and for Indians all over the world, to have an individual of Indian origin become the first ethnic minority Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It's absolutely marvellous news.
It really does feel like a moment, doesn't it? Is it something that transcends party politics? We get away from party politics. That fact in and of itself is, in your view, is that something that a nation should be proud of?
Well, when I came here to the UK as a 19-year-old in the early 1980s to study, I was told by my family and friends very clearly, if you decide to work after your studies, you'll never get to the top. You won't be allowed to get to the top. As a foreigner, there will be a glass ceiling. And I'm sorry to say they were absolutely right. But over the last 3-4 decades, I've seen that glass ceiling absolutely shattered. And I really believe this country now is a country where anyone can get anywhere, regardless of race, religion or background. And here's an example of Rishi Sunak making it right to the very top as Prime Minister of the country. We've got Asians at the cabinet table, Asians leading business people. They're reaching the very top in every field. And I think it's wonderful. However, we still have a long way to go. I'm the first ethnic minority individual to have been appointed President of the Confederation of British Industry in its history. It took a long time to get there, but we got there. In Parliament, we now have over 100 MPs from an ethnic minority background and members of the House of Lords. But 100 is still half the percentage of ethnic minority population in the UK. We're only halfway there. We've still got a long way to go, but we're making phenomenal progress. And for somebody now to become Prime Minister, that is a real inspiration to others, and that creates aspiration, that creates achievement, and that achievement in itself creates inspiration. It's a virtuous circle. It's wonderful.
And I think people watching will just can feel that coming from you from every pore. That said, you clearly want to celebrate that today, but how great is the expectation on Rishi Sunak, who has a mountain of problems in his in-tray, and we will talk about those in a moment, but that he has so much to do on a practical level with this nation right now. How great is that extra layer of expectation for him to try to achieve even more in the way that you suggested? I mean, we remember when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States and the weight of expectation on him, as if suddenly there was going to be no racism in the United States because he was in the White House. It's an extra, is it a burden? Is it a layer of responsibility? What is it?
How serendipitous that Rishi Sunak has been appointed Prime Minister on Diwali Day. Diwali is the Hindu New Year, so this is a new start. And of course there are great expectations. But I've worked closely with Rishi Sunak as President of the CBI over the 2 years when he was Chancellor, and it couldn't have been in more challenging times. I would say the most challenging times in the world since the Second World War, with the pandemic and then the sad war in Ukraine, and then the cost of living crisis and inflation and energy, one challenge after another. And I've worked with him, and I know how bright he is, how he listens, how he's collaborated with business, and that's how we got things like the furlough scheme. That's how we had the government guaranteed bank loans. Those initiatives costing £400 billion saved jobs and saved businesses to the extent we've got the lowest unemployment rate in this country since the early 70s. So I have faith that he understands business, and as long as he continues to work collaboratively and brings his party together, works in a unified way, brings stability. They've only got 2 years till the next election. There isn't much time, but I have full faith that he will be able to deal with these extraordinary challenges. I've seen it firsthand. He's got the ability. He's capable.
I mean, it's interesting that in his very first statement, he has nodded to, this afternoon, profound economic challenges. That is a phrase that he has used. I mean, you clearly believe he is absolutely up to the task, but he is inheriting, well, we know we spent the last 7 weeks talking about the economic situation that he is inheriting. How in reality does he begin to tackle that at a time of crisis, at a time of households worrying about their energy bills, all the other factors that we know about?
What has really hurt me and many others is how over the last week, since the 23rd of September, Britain has become a laughing stock around the world. This great nation, this nation that was looked up to, trusted, a leader, not a superpower, but we've been a global power. We're still the 6th largest economy in the world. We have phenomenal capabilities. We've got to get through this now and build back our reputation. That's what Rishi's got to do. And it's not going to be about putting up taxes the whole time. The highest tax burden is not the way to do it. It's got to be to encourage investment, to encourage growth, and to balance the books, to have the confidence of the markets. I think he will get that confidence of the markets, of the business community, of his party, and of the country on the whole. And then we can start building and growing. And it's that growth that's going to create the jobs, that's going to pay the taxes, that's going to pay down the debt. And we've got a debt about 100% of GDP. It's much lower, actually, the second lowest in the G7. But he is very prudent. I know that, having worked with him. And I think he also does want low taxes in the long run as well. We've seen austerity hasn't worked. We know that low interest rates, we're through that period now, but we can't suddenly go up to interest rates of 5%, which is what it used to be before the financial crisis. It's got to be a question of taking everyone and also helping businesses through this winter, when small and medium-sized businesses in particular will be really suffering. They'll be looking for help in the way that was given during the pandemic, but Rishi's been there, he's got the experience, so I'm confident that he will help.
Very, very good to talk to you. Thank you so much. We'll be talking again, I'm sure, but thank you for now. Lord Billamoria there, thank you so much. Vice President of the business organisation, the CBI, among many other things. Let's stay with this and get reaction from a Conservative councillor. Hanan Sarwar joins me from Cheshire. Councillor, a very good afternoon to you. And I'm told that over the summer you actually voted for Liz Truss, so I'm very interested to know what you think of where we are this afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon. I think first and foremost, congratulations to Rishi Sunak to becoming the UK's first British Asian Prime Minister. It's actually a very historical day. And I hope for the sake of our country and in our nationals' interest, the Conservative Party, its members and all the MPs across all the different sectors are able to fully back him and support him in these very difficult times. I think genuinely we're in such a difficult economic situation with the war in Ukraine, the cost of living, inflation, bills are soaring. We really need now a very competent government. And I think Rishi Sunak over the course of the weekend really did build up some momentum from MPs across the different spectrums of the Conservative Party. And I really hope he appoints a unity cabinet and we see some big names supporting him. And I wish him the best of luck because he's got a very difficult job ahead of him.
Yes, on so many levels, as we've been reflecting. Do you feel that he can and will unite the party? Because only a few weeks ago, we were talking about the fact that the party didn't want him. They wanted Liz Truss, and you were one of the people who voted for her. So what's different now, only a matter of weeks later?
Yeah, I know. I think majority of the Conservative Party members, I voted for Liz Truss, and at the time she did present some sensible policies. But over the last 45 days, we've seen that she obviously tried to implement her plan for growth too quickly, and the markets didn't react to that properly. And unfortunately, she made some quite detrimental mistakes to her premiership that obviously led to her resignation last week. And I think it would have been nice for the Conservative Party membership to be given a vote for our Prime Minister, but it was very clear that the Parliamentary Party, with an outstanding majority, backed and endorsed Rishi Sunak. And I think for our party's sake and for our country's sake, all Conservative Party members, councillors, members of Parliament all need to unite behind him and give him the best possible chance to sort of save our country from the current economic situation. And
so fundamentally, in the coming weeks and months, is it all about the economy above anything else? Yes, most definitely. I think Rishi Sunak needs to obviously calm the markets down, fill this 40 billion black hole we've got, and allow for some stability in our economic climate, and also help address the cost of living crisis, help bring down inflation, but also support our allies in Ukraine and sort of bring the UK back to its dominant forefront position. And unfortunately, the last couple of weeks we haven't had that. We've been an absolute mess. Thank you for now. Much more to discuss, but we may talk again. Thanks very much for now. Conservative councillor Hanan Sarwar, thank you for joining me there from Wilmslow. Well, Rishi Sunak's in tray, as we have touched on, is enormous, really, isn't it? Full of very big challenges ahead. The economic situation is significantly worse than it was when Liz Truss took office. Higher mortgage rates, energy bills, as we've touched on there, and inflation, all combining it to make it really a very tough winter indeed for so many people up and down the country. The NHS and social care system is struggling. We've talked about that a lot in the last week or two in particular. And of course, the war in Ukraine, which is largely driving those high energy bills, is very much continuing. Let's take a moment to discuss one of those issues, NHS and social care. Saffron Cordery joins me, the interim chief executive of NHS Providers, which represents hospitals, ambulance trusts, many aspects of the NHS that people rely on. Saffron Cordery, the demands on the new Prime Minister are many. What are the key areas in your specialism that you think Rishi Sunak needs to be looking at?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are huge demands. We've got 130,000 vacancies across the NHS, so critical frontline staff are not available for work for many, many reasons. And we also have a waiting list that has topped 7 million now. We know that waiting times across all types of services, mental health, community, those handover times in ambulances are also particularly severe. And we know that we've got a massive challenge in social care. So that's just 3 different areas that will be, we hope, top of the in tray for both Rishi Sunak and his Chancellor, assuming that Jeremy Hunt stays in role, because I think it's absolutely critical that we both get the economy sorted out so that there is the available funds to focus on public services and the NHS in particular.
Are you worried about strikes?
Industrial action is something that is looming this autumn, and I think we need to be really clear about how that will play out in terms of challenges on frontline services. But I think going back to the points I made, it's absolutely critical that we look at how we tackle the workforce challenges and the cost of living challenges that staff are facing. So we put out a report a couple of weeks ago that told us that many staff are actually going without meals in order to feed their
their children and their families. Some can't afford to actually get to work. So we know that the cost of living is a big issue, particularly for lower paid staff. So that's something we've got to sort out. But I think what we do welcome here is now hopefully some stability. There's been massive upheaval. There has been policy paralysis for the last few months since the leadership campaigns and then a new Prime Minister and then a Prime Minister resigning. So what we want to see is a bit of stability and to sort out both the funding and the workforce for the NHS that can get on with the job in hand, and to look to social care and make sure that we have a social care system that's invested in and is fit for purpose.
Well, and I mean, yes, interesting and not surprising that you mentioned social care, because it's less than a week when we were all discussing that big report that showed that people couldn't get out of hospital, as we know, and has said for some time, because of the lack of staffing inside the social care sector. And if a new Prime Minister can solve the social care element, it's a bit like sorting out a jigsaw, isn't it? But that's a big if.
Absolutely. I think we've got to make sure that social care is a real priority, because when we sort social care, we sort out the flow of patients through hospital, and we also sort out some really critical areas that are overlooked, like capacity in mental health and capacity in community services. And I think the other thing we have to remember is that a functioning health and care system actually contributes to the economy as well. It's important that we invest in health and care so that health and care can give back to the community, to society, to the economy. So it's not just taking, it's also giving, as well as contributing to the health and well-being of the nation.
Saffron Cordery, thanks very much for your time for now. Thank you from NHS providers.
Thank you.
Let's continue to get reaction from around the UK. Let's head back to Wakefield and join our correspondent Fiona Trott. Fiona.
Well, this is a city that asked to be levelled up. It's why the Conservatives grabbed this red wall seat at the last election. Labour won it back, of course, in this year's by-election. But people here are asking this question today: can Rishi Sunak deliver on that earlier election promise? What your reaction is to Rishi Sunak becoming Prime Minister?
In 3 words, no thank you. He's not, we haven't elected him. He's been voted by members of his own party. He's, the third Prime Minister we've had in so many months. No, I think we need a general election. You know, what can I say really? No thanks.
I think, as I expected, I think he will give us stability because he was a Chancellor before and he handled that very well. What more can I say?
I'm not impressed. I just feel they're all in the same bucket. I think the country at the moment, it's just in that much of devastation, and it's gone too low for what I would like to see the country become. Like the health sector's gone down. And me as a residential worker, I see families struggle because the gas and electricity's gone up, the food's gone up. The care of the young people, they've got no money, no increase in money to help them survive.
Without going too much into it, yeah, we're just going to get taxed more. This guy's going to give tax allowance to his buddies. We're just getting bummed. How much tax we're paying already? I mean, it's fuel, everything. I can't afford to live. I don't exactly earn a lot of wage, earn £1,000 a week. And I still can't afford sometimes to provide for my family because of energy bills, etc. It's a joke. Tories, they need out, mate, but I don't vote just for the simple fact of there's nobody I want in power. I don't like none of them.
Well, this part of the world is like many towns and cities across the UK. It used to rely on manufacturing, on mining. Now it wants development and investment. It wants higher paid jobs. And like many other towns and cities, families here are struggling. We spoke to one shopkeeper here earlier today who's selling school uniforms at cost. He's not making a profit on those. That's what he's doing for some families because they need help. They want change here. They saw that today, but they're not yet convinced that they're going to feel it.
Fiona, thank you for now. Our correspondent Fiona Trott there getting reaction for us in Wakefield. We will have much more, of course, throughout the evening, much more from 5 o'clock. Rishi Sunak is the new Prime Minister. let's as I say, let's just show you the scene across Westminster. A beautiful image there of the Houses of Parliament tonight. Over at Westminster. I was expecting a different camera angle and hoping to tell you something about what a number of MPs were up to tonight, but we don't have that right now. But anyway, it's a lovely image to look at, isn't it? Rishi Sunak said just a few brief words earlier this afternoon. We're still waiting for a little more detail, sort of logistics, choreography of what will happen. We think that the formalities will take place tomorrow, but we are still waiting for confirmation of that. Much more coverage from here, from 5 o'clock. We will just pause for a moment, though, because on a very busy day, we will try and catch up with the weather prospects as well in this part of London and indeed wherever you are across the country. All the latest details come from Stav Danail. Stav.
Hello there. After some very wild weather over the weekend, today and also tomorrow look relatively calm in comparison, with quite a bit of sunshine around. And for the rest of this week, it's actually going to turn even milder with our air source coming in from the south. It will at times bring some rain, some of which could be quite heavy, but they'll be interspersed with sunshine and showers. Through this evening and overnight, most of the showers will be confined across northern and western areas, very few getting in towards the east. So a lot of dry weather here, and with the breeze and that slightly milder air mass, and temperatures no lower than 7 to 11 degrees. So we're in between weather systems, if you like, for Tuesday. That's why it's going to be another quiet day. But generally, low pressure will be dominating the scene. And this next feature will be pushing up into the south and southwest of the country later on Tuesday. But if you look at that, it's a fine day, I think, to come for most places. A lot of dry weather, some sunshine, a few showers dotted around here and there. And then the wet and windy weather starts to arrive across the southwest later on. Temperatures up to around 18, maybe 19 degrees in the warmest spots, generally 15, 16 in the north. Now, this feature starts to develop a little bit as it moves northwards across the country. Most of the rain, the strongest of the winds, will be towards the western half of the UK. You can see plenty of isobars on there. What it will be doing is dragging up some very mild air from the south as it continues to advance northwards. We hold on to these south or southwesterly winds for the rest of the week. So a wet, windy start to the day on Wednesday across northern areas. That will clear northwards, and then it's sunshine and blustery showers, some really heavy ones across some northern and western areas, a few getting in towards the east as well. But in the sunshine and with that mild air mass, we could be up to around 20 degrees or so across some eastern areas. And we hold on to that mild southerly breeze as we move into Thursday. Again, there's a chance of some showers or longer spells of rain, some of which could be on the heavy side, particularly across England and Wales to begin with. Those showers spread their way northwards, I think, through the day on Thursday. And then when the sunshine comes out with that mild air mass, we could perhaps be up to around 21, maybe 22 degrees in the warmest spots across the southeast, mid to high teens further north as well. So these values are a lot higher than what we expect this time of year. And we hold on to the mild theme through Friday and indeed into the weekend. But with low pressure always nearby, we're likely to see further showers and longer spells of rain. Most of the rain will be across the north and the west.
Why not lift a living income so people could afford the basics?
It's always a compromise, and compromises mean that some people get more and others get less.
Far too simplistic. That is not how the world works.
First of all, thank you for explaining.
Did he mislead Parliament? My view is he didn't.
It's always somebody else's fault.
Whatever side you're on.
Parliamentary democracy, that does matter.
The conversation starts here.
Let's start with this breaking news.
Politics Live, tomorrow at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer.
People are travelling again, heading back out on the road and rediscovering their wanderlust.
Exploring new destinations and cultures, making fresh friends and creating memories that will last a lifetime.
That's why at the Travel Show, we're expanding our horizons too. And wherever we go,
we want you to come with us. Now that might make for an awful lot of excess baggage, but we think you're worth it.
The Travel Show. Watch now on BBC iPlayer.
You're watching BBC News with me, Tim Willcox, live from Downing Street, where Rishi Sunak has just been announced as the UK's next Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party.
It is the greatest privilege of my life to be able to serve the party I love and give back to the country I owe so much to.
The former Chancellor will become the UK's first British Asian Prime Minister and the youngest for more than a century, as senior figures in the party call for unity.
There is no point in refighting the arguments of the summer. The only thing now in the minds of my Conservative parliamentary colleagues should be supporting the Prime Minister, supporting the government, supporting the British people.
Labour have reiterated their call for a general election, echoed by the SNP, Lib Dems and the Green Party.
The people of this country now deserve us to go to the electorate to put our policies forward about how we're going to deal with this cost of living crisis that the Conservatives have put upon the British people, and let them have a vote.
Hello and welcome to BBC News live from Downing Street. 7 weeks after losing to Liz Truss in this year's first Tory leadership contest, Rishi Sunak is the new leader of the Conservative Party. Mr Sunak is the first British Asian to head the UK government, and at 42 years old, he will be the youngest Prime Minister in more than a century. Mr Sunak's victory was confirmed this afternoon when his last remaining challenger, Penny Mordaunt, dropped out of the race just a few minutes before the nominations closed. He will take office as the UK faces enormous economic challenges, and with Labour, the SNP and the Lib Dems all demanding an immediate general election so that voters can have their say. Just under an hour ago, Mr Sunak made this statement to the country.
I'd like to pay tribute to Liz Truss for her dedicated public service to the country. She has led with dignity and grace through a time of great change and under exceptionally difficult circumstances, both at home and abroad. I am humbled and honoured to have the support of my parliamentary colleagues and to be elected as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. It is the greatest privilege of my life to be able to serve the party I love and give back to the country I owe so much to. The United Kingdom is a great country, but there is no doubt we face a profound economic challenge. We now need stability and unity, and I will make it my utmost priority to bring our party and our country together, because that is the only way we will overcome the challenges we face and build a better, more prosperous future for our children and our grandchildren. I pledge that I will serve you with integrity and humility, and I will work day in, day out to deliver for the British people.
Well, Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner demanded a general election, saying that Rishi Sunak had no electoral mandate.
I think it's a continuation of the problems that the Conservatives have faced. Look, we're going to have 3 Prime Ministers in 3 months. We've had, Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor, where we've seen low growth. We've not seen that growth in our economy. He's failed to deal with the inflation that we've seen, and families are really worried about the cost of living that they face, and have heard nothing from Rishi Sunak in the, week or whatever it's been that we've had the contest about how he's going to actually tackle the challenges that people are facing today.
Does Labour fear Rishi Sunak in a general election?
Labour thinks that we should be having a general election. I think everybody who I've spoken to, the public, have said we should be having a general election. There is no mandate now. The Conservatives have completely broken their promises, broke our economy, and now they want to see a general election. They can't just keep doling out Prime Ministers every month because they're in total chaos and they've lost control of the market and haven't got any ideas of how they're going to tackle the cost of living that people are facing.
Is weeks more of uncertainty, the potential yet another change in Prime Minister, through a general election really what the country needs?
Well, what we've seen played out is a coronation here and not an actual election where people have a mandate to serve the British people of this country. You know, Rishi Sunak was rejected by his own party membership only weeks ago. The people of this country now deserve us to go to the electorate to put our policies forward about how we're going to deal with this cost of living crisis that the Conservatives have put upon the British people and let them have a vote.
Deputy Leader Angela Rayner. Well, let's cross to our correspondent Helen Catt, who is in Central Lobby for us now. He's calling for unity. Can he unify the party now, do you think?
Well, it is certainly going to be a challenge. We've seen the depth of division within the Conservative Party over the last few months. I think what might be a promising sign for Rishi Sunak is that this afternoon there has felt like there has been a bit of an outbreak of calm here in Central Lobby. I've spoken to MPs, mostly Rishi Sunak backing MPs who've come in here, who've backed him the whole way through, who are delighted that he is now in the leader of the Conservative Party and soon, of course, to be in number 10, but also MPs who started off or have in the past backed other candidates who felt that actually no, that they have come round to having Rishi Sunak as the leader. They sound pretty optimistic. They think he's going to bring calm and stability, that word that we keep on hearing. Now, of course, it's worth saying that when Liz Truss became Prime Minister, there were promises that people would swing behind her, and that didn't last very long. But it certainly feels like it does feel quite calm. It felt reasonably optimistic, the MPs that I've spoken to this afternoon. And I think what's also notable is that if there are any critics, they haven't been here in front of the cameras saying so. And that could prove really, really important for how the next few days unfold.
Yeah, but it's fair to say, though, that he probably wouldn't have won had it gone to the membership vote. And a lot of MPs going back to speak to their constituencies will perhaps be under pressure because of that.
Well, that is a thought. The thing is, nobody really knows how it would have gone had it gone to the membership with Penny Mordaunt on the ballot. The assumption had been that if it had gone with Boris Johnson on the ballot, then he would have won. But actually, interestingly enough, there was an MP I was just chatting to here who'd balloted about 300 of his members. Now, this is unscientific, obviously, so don't read too much into this. But actually, that wasn't showing. That was showing wins for Rishi Sunak. It wasn't showing clear wins for other people. And he said he'd been contacted by some of his members who actually had said that they didn't think it should go to the membership at this stage, that it did have stability. So that the sort of traditional thinking has been that the membership at large is going to be outraged at not having a vote and that they would have voted for anyone but Rishi. That's been the conventional wisdom. I'm not actually so sure that's entirely true, but the thing is we will never know on that point. All
right, Helen, now thank you very much indeed. Let's speak to one MP who backed him for the leadership, Laura Trott, Conservative MP for Sevenoaks. As I say, Rishi Sunak's supporter. You must be delighted. Where is his electoral mandate, though?
Well, I think it's very important that we remember that the party was elected in 2019 with a very clear mandate, and Rishi's been very forthright about the fact that he's going to continue with that. And I think that we need to get on with that. We cannot have the instability which, weeks and weeks of a general election would bring.
Who's he going to make Chancellor?
Oh, that's a matter for Rishi rather than for me.
And what sort of policies will he want his Chancellor to pursue? Will he go along, do you think, with the Jeremy Hunt programme? Is it possible that Jeremy Hunt could stay?
Well, I think, what we saw during the summer was Rishi talking continually about fiscal responsibility. That is core to who he is and what he's about. As I said, the matter for who is Chancellor is up to him, but personally I think that Jeremy Hunt has done a fantastic job in restoring fiscal credibility in the last couple of days, and I think that's what we all need to be focused on in the coming weeks.
But presumably, he's talked about wanting a cabinet of all the talents, so he will be offering perhaps positions, will he, to people who didn't support him in the first and second run?
As I said, it's not for me to kind of speculate on appointments because, frankly, I don't know. But I think what is really important now as a party is that we come together, we show unity, we make sure that we're appointing people on the basis of merit. And we saw today what a wide base of support that Rishi has from the party. Over 200 people pledged to support him. They come from all corners. And I think that's a really positive way in which we can move forward now and start addressing the issues that really matter to the country.
Yeah, but he didn't make this position, did he, last month? And within a month, he's now Prime Minister.
Yes, he's now Prime Minister because obviously what happened with Liz showed that she didn't have the support within the parliamentary party. Rishi has shown that he does have that. And I think what is notable today is the amount of unity that there is around him and around his programme now to take us forward, to take us back to the 2019 manifesto, and also to restore fiscal credibility.
Just looking at his personality as well, I mean, how difficult is it going to be for a man, 42, who's married into dynastic wealth through his wife's family? How difficult is it going to be for him to push through these very tough economic decisions going forward?
Well, I always think you should judge someone on what they do, not where they came from. And I think that he has shown throughout his whole career that he will stand by people in the darkest of times. Look what he did with furlough. He will stand by the most vulnerable. Look what he did in terms of kind of raising the minimum wage thresholds. You know, this is a person who has a proven track record of looking after the most vulnerable, and I have absolutely no doubt that that is what he will continue to do.
I don't know when the last time you spoke to him. I'm not sure if you've spoken to him since this vote was, or the news was announced. What do you think he will do with Boris Johnson supporters, with Penny Mordaunt supporters?
As I said, it's not for me to speculate in terms of positions or anything like that, but I think the key thing to get across is that we need to unite as a party. I think there is a will to do that, which is really the most important thing, and we need to stop talking about ourselves and start talking about the things that matter to the country and really get us through the very difficult economic times that face us.
All right, Laura Trott, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on BBC News. Well, earlier my colleague Joanna, who's been here all day before me, spoke to the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper, about why they felt a general election was the way forward now.
Well, I think what's important for Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party to realise is that it is the Conservative Party itself that has caused so much chaos and so much instability, and the only way to get rid of that chaos and instability is to remove the Conservative Party from government. There is overwhelming support across the country for a general election. I think it's outrageous that we are now on the third Conservative Prime Minister in just as many months, and the public are not being given a say in who they want to take the country forward and to solve these unprecedented crises. The fact is there has to be a general election because that's the only way that we can move forward from the chaos and instability that the Conservative Party itself has created.
But what we see is that the markets are stabilising, that Rishi Sunak is, they've responded well to the thought that it was going to be Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. Why not, if you're so concerned about stability, let that settle, see what happens, and would that not be preferable to a general election right now, which would actually just bring more uncertainty?
Well, the markets, as you say, do appear to have improved slightly, but the situation facing struggling families across the country has not. The fact is that Rishi Sunak refused to implement a proper windfall tax. He was supporting Boris Johnson even when he was proven to be a liar and a lawbreaker. This is a man who boasted during the leadership contest in the summer about taking money away from poor communities and giving it to richer communities. We have a twin-demic facing the NHS and our care services, and our health and care services have been run into the ground by these successive Conservative Prime Ministers. There are so many problems facing our country right now, and it's clear from months of infighting and years of infighting that the Conservative Party does not have a plan and cannot be trusted. They are out of touch and they should be out of government.
Well, let's speak now to Adrian Ramsey, joint leader of the Green Party. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News. Do you accept that for Rishi Sunak it is impossible now, because of the world climate, because of the war in Ukraine, because of energy prices, to commit to the manifesto commitments of his predecessor, but one, Boris Johnson?
No, I don't accept that. I think the principles on which the Conservative MPs were elected in 2019 still need to hold suit if they want to hold government and hold the mandate. So, for example, they promised to increase the number of nurses by 50,000, and yet we've seen that number of vacancies across the country. They promised to reduce the cost of living, and yet we've seen an increase in cost of living, people's rents and mortgages spiralling, people's day-to-day costs spiralling. They made promises to deliver net zero carbon emissions, and they're taking us in the wrong direction on that as well, with the vote to allow fracking and new oil and gas licences. So on all of these areas, we've got a growing cost of living crisis, we've got a climate emergency, we have a government taking us in the wrong direction, and a government that doesn't have a mandate on which to do this.
Just focusing then on the green issues here, isn't that just economic reality that those licences for North Sea oil and gas do need to be issued now just to keep the lights and the power on?
Not at all. What we need to be doing is focusing on how we can reduce the amount of energy that we use. We have the leakiest homes in Europe here in the UK. People are putting their heating on at the moment, and heaters going out of the walls, going out of the doors because homes are not properly insulated. And that's just one of many examples of how we could reduce the energy that we use in this country.
But that, forgive me, Mr. Ramsey, I mean, that's going to take months, if not years, isn't it? We're looking about this winter now and potentially a very difficult spring.
Yes, it will take some time to deliver that, although the government's own Lord Deben, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, has said we could start to insulate homes for this winter. And the best time to have started this would have been years ago, when people like Rishi Sunak were blocking a nationwide programme of home insulation.
OK, so forgive me, just in the short term, but yes. In the short term, though, isn't it pragmatic to rely on the actual resources that this country has to get us over this hurdle?
It takes many years for new oil and gas to come on stream. What we could do far more quickly is to put that investment into clean forms of renewable energy, genuinely homegrown renewable energy, which can allow us to move away from dependence, yes, on Putin's oil, but also dependence on other fossil fuels that are causing havoc through the climate changes that we're seeing, through the floods in Pakistan, the impact that it's having on food security, on freak weather patterns in the UK and beyond. We're already having climate changes happening around us, and people are really suffering as well with their fuel bills going through the roof. And the cheapest, greenest form of energy is the energy we don't have to use, and that's why we want to see measures put into insulating people's homes, into other measures that help people to reduce their fuel bills. And those are things that can create jobs and create a greener economy at the same time, which would be really beneficial during this time of economic chaos that the Conservatives have created.
OK, Andrew Ramsey, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on BBC News. Well, a little earlier, before I came down to Downing Street, Joanna spoke to the SNP's Stephen Flynn, who echoed Labour's and the Lib Dems and indeed the Greens' call for a general election and outlined the case for an independence referendum sooner rather than later.
The unity and the stability that the people of Scotland need is to have governments that we vote for and governments that implement policies that are, in our view, the right ones to do. That's why we have Scottish parliamentary elections and the SNP are successful, and of course the Tories are not yet. Despite that, we still have Tory governments imposed upon us time after time, and this is just another example of that. But Rishi Sunak, when you look at his policies, is actually quite scary. This is a man who during the summer said quite clearly that he was happy to take money from poorer areas to put it into wealthier communities. This is a guy who during the pandemic, of course, provided no financial support whatsoever to some 3 million people they excluded as they came to be known. And of course, much like Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak was fined during, as a result of his actions during Partygate. He is not quite clearly fit for office, and he has no mandate, not just from the people of the UK, but from the people of Scotland.
Well, let's just have another look at our new Prime Minister, officially sworn in, we understand, tomorrow. The former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, had been the favourite to succeed his old boss, Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister after his resignation in July. But he failed to persuade Tory members, who ultimately put Liz Truss in Downing Street in September. Mr. Sunak, who hasn't commented on the recent turmoil, said he was standing as PM to fix a profound economic crisis as well as unite his party. He became Chancellor in February 2020 and within weeks found himself having to steer the UK economy as the pandemic and its lockdowns began. In April, the finances of Mr. Sunak and his family came under intense scrutiny, with the tax affairs of his heiress wife, Akshata Murthy, placed in the spotlight. She later announced that she would start paying British tax on her overseas earnings to relieve political pressure on her husband. Rishi Sunak is a practicing Hindu and will become the first Asian Prime Minister. Well, let's go live now, or back to our correspondent Helen Catt, who joins us now again from Central Lobby. Helen.
And I'm joined by Mark Harper. He's the Conservative MP for the Forest of Dean, and he was a supporter of Rishi Sunak. What do you make of the speed that this has happened at, and how we've suddenly got Rishi Sunak about to become the Prime Minister?
Well, I think actually the fact that we've managed to deal with this rapidly, I think will be welcomed actually by the public. There's some really important challenges facing the country, not least the economic challenges. And I think actually once it was clear from her statement last Thursday that Liz Truss couldn't continue as Prime Minister, I think it was incumbent on the Conservative Party to resolve that quickly. And we've now got our new leader, Rishi Sunak, and at some point in the not too distant future, in the next few days or day, he'll be asked by His Majesty the King to form a government, and I think he can then get on with forming a government and dealing with those challenges.
So he's got a huge amount to do in terms of dealing with the challenges facing the country, but also the challenges facing your party. You're a former chief whip. You know how hard it is to keep discipline in a party. Can the party come back together after this? Because they said they would after Liz Truss was elected.
Yeah. Well, yes, I think they can. And I think, look, it's not going to be easy, but I think two things. First of all, I think all Conservative MPs need to focus on what we're in politics for, which is serving the public and putting the national interest first. So that's, I think, very helpful. And I think Rishi Sunak has said he's going to build a broad-based cabinet, drawing people from across the party based on competence and talent, but also making sure all strands of opinion are represented. And I think that will really help. So I think once he's formed that government, that'll be a clear signal to the parliamentary party that we all need to come together as a team to put working for the public ahead of every other consideration.
And do you think the Conservative Party can promise that OK, we've had a very turbulent year, but from now on it's business and it's going to be stable?
Yes, I think we can promise that, and I think we must promise that. I think that is what the country expects us to do. I think we have this one last chance to demonstrate that, and I don't think the public will give us another one. So I think all of my colleagues need to recognise how serious the situation is, the things that people are worried about, and demonstrate that the only thing we're focused on is their interests, the public's interests, and not our own.
And one last question. Of course, the Conservative Party is not just the party in Westminster, it is the party in the country as well. What are you hearing from your party members who are now not going to get any choice in this?
Well, certainly my party members that I've spoken to in the Forest of Dean over the last few days were very clear that they wanted this sorted out. They recognised that a majority of party members voted for Liz Truss, but it was obvious from what Liz Truss said that it wasn't working, and I think my members were very clear and my constituents were clear we needed it resolved and resolved quickly, and they've been very clear that they're very pleased with that it has been, and that Rishi Sunak is now the leader of the party.
Mark Harper, thank you very much. So that's a name from another Rishi Sunak supporter. We've had quite a few through in Central Lobby this afternoon, but generally it feels like a bit of a period of calm. We'll see how long that lasts.
We will. Let's hear more on the reaction to today's political events from the Guardian's political correspondent, Aubrey Allegretti. Is the Tory turmoil over, at least in the short term?
Well, that's a very good question, and one I've been asking lots of Conservative MPs today. And I think what's interesting is that you very rarely hear the affirmative answer yes from them, because in private what they say instead is that they hope so, that the party can come together, and that it has to. What you don't often hear is an emphatic yes, it certainly will. Now, Rishi Sunak is almost certainly going to get quite a long honeymoon period, during which those people who fought to keep him out of Downing Street sort of slink into the background, lick their wounds, and those people who just opposed him on sort of more policy grounds magnanimously sort of slip away. But I think he's going to face a very difficult time after Christmas, going into those May local elections, because the problems Liz Truss faced, for example, with the plummeting poll ratings and dire economic warnings, aren't going to go away.
How much of a help is it that he's a Brexiteer and always has been and hasn't changed his mind on that?
I think that will help him quite a lot. I mean, he didn't necessarily get the endorsement of the European Research Group, which met just before 2 p.m, when it was still looking like there was the chance, at least, of a contest. But his Brexiteer credentials were sort of brushed aside by Liz Truss, who of course was a campaigner for Remain in 2016 and a Brexit convert. He has obviously been trying to kind of make sure that he still gets viewed as a sort of ardent Brexiteer. He's committed to things like, for example, scrapping retained EU law, and he's tried to appear fairly tight on immigration by supporting the Rwanda policy. But of course, there are those who think that perhaps maybe the answer to some of the economic woes we'll be seeing this autumn might be eased immigration. Should we be bringing in more people to try and fill some of the jobs we haven't been able to? He's going to have to sort of try and strike that balance quite closely.
What are you hearing about his preferences for the big jobs in government? Chancellor, for example, I think back in the summer, Steve Barclay was one of the names that was being floated around. What are you hearing?
Well, Mel Stride is another name. I mean, he was the chair of the Treasury Committee in Parliament and obviously Sunak's campaign manager, and has been working very closely holding Kwasi Kwarteng's feet to the fire over the last few months. So there are probably going to be the return of some familiar faces that we haven't seen for quite a while. That could be, for example, Oliver Dowden, the former Conservative Party chairman. It could be Robert Jenrick, the former Community Secretary, and others. I suspect that the cabinet will look quite different. However, Jeremy Hunt probably going to stay at the top. That sends quite a clear signal to all the sort of markets that you want to remain as stable as possible, that it's going to be the same person there. Although, of course, now there'll be somebody in number 10 who has a little bit more kind of legitimacy and is able to kind of be leading the political project, rather than somebody like Liz Truss, who it seemed was kowtowing and had to do everything that Jeremy Hunt was telling her to do.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, social media was saying that Gavin Williamson popped in to see Rishi Sunak a few hours ago. What are you hearing about that? Could that be a return to government for him?
Well, Gavin Williamson has never been far away from the leadership campaigns. He's been working, we understand, quite earnestly, and was, of course, trying to help run the whipping operation to get support for Rishi Sunak off the ground. He is a former chief whip, so potentially there's a role open for him back in that office.
All right, Aubrey, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's some of the reaction from here in Westminster. Let's just broaden out a bit and see where else in the UK, what people are feeling there. Fiona Trott joins us now from Wakefield. Fiona.
Well, there's so much expectation here because this is a part of the world that asked to be levelled up. It's how the Conservatives grabbed this red wall seat at the last election. Labour won it back again in 2019. But the question people are asking here today is, can Rishi Sunak deliver on that earlier election promise? What your reaction is to Rishi Sunak becoming Prime Minister?
In 2 words, well, 3 words, no thank you. He's not, we haven't elected him. He's been voted by members of his own party. He's, what, the 3rd Prime Minister we've had in so many months. No, I think we need a general election. You know, what can I say really? No thanks.
I think, as expected, I think he will give us stability because he was a Chancellor before and he handled that very well. What more can I say?
I'm not impressed. I just feel they're all in the same bucket. I think the country at the moment, it's just in that much of devastation and it's gone too low for what I would like to see the country become. Like the health sector's gone down. And me as a residential worker, I see families struggle because the gas and electricity's gone up, the food's gone up. The care of the young people, they've got no money, no increase in money to help them survive.
Without going in too much into it, yeah, we're just going to get taxed more. This guy's going to give tax allowance to his buddies. We're just getting bombed. How much tax we're paying already? I mean, it's fuel, everything. I can't afford to live. I don't exactly earn a low wage, I earn £1,000 a week. And I still can't afford sometimes to provide for my family because of energy bills, etc. It's a joke. Tories, they need out, mate, but I don't vote just for the simple fact of there's nobody I want in power. I don't like none of them.
Well, Wakefield is like other cities and towns across the UK that used to rely on manufacturing and mining and now wants higher paid jobs, it wants investment, it wants development, and like elsewhere, families here are struggling. We spoke to one shopkeeper earlier today who told us that he's selling school uniforms at cost. He's not making a profit on those because local families need help. They want change here. They saw that today, but they're not yet convinced they're going to feel it soon.
Fiona, live in Wakefield, thank you very much indeed. Well, earlier my colleague Joanna spoke to Paul Johnson, the director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that is the UK's leading independent economics research institute, and she began by asking him how difficult a job Rishi Sunak faced in trying to deal now with the current economic crisis.
Well, there are certainly some very difficult choices coming down the road. The public finances are not in a great position, despite the undoing of most of the tax cuts that were announced a month or so ago. And one of the problems, I think, that the new Prime Minister and his Chancellor face is that given all of the uncertainty that's been created over the last few weeks, they may have to make more difficult decisions than they otherwise would have had to, because the markets are still somewhat spooked, and they're going to be wanting to see some clear and decisive action, perhaps more than they would have required had we not had all of this upset over the last few weeks.
And that brings us back to a question that's been asked a number of times since the so-called mini-budget. Who's in charge in the end? Is it the markets?
Well, the markets, in some sense, are always in charge. I mean, we are all part of the markets. So the decisions that we as citizens make matter enormously for what's happening to the economy, but also the decisions that people who we are borrowing from as a nation make. I mean, don't forget, this is all about us borrowing hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds, and someone has to be willing to lend us that money. And if they stop being willing to lend us that money because they're unconvinced about the stability of the government or the extent to which their fiscal policies make sense, then they don't have to lend us that money. We are beholden to them. But all that means is that we need a sustainable, sensible, rational fiscal policy. Now, what we saw on September the 23rd was a government deviating from that, and deviating from that to some quite considerable degree. That still leaves an enormous amount of scope for very different policies. You can see that Germany and France, the USA and Australia have completely different sets of policies. They're all well-functioning economies in one sense or another. You just have to make choices within constraints and recognise those constraints. So yes, we are constrained by what we do. We can't just do whatever we want because things cost money, and we can't just magic up economic activity from nowhere. And I think that was the mistake that the previous Chancellor made.
Paul Johnson. Well, Rishi Sunak is the first non-Christian, the first person of colour to become Prime Minister of this country. Let's speak now to Baroness Chakrabarti, a Labour member of the House of Lords. Let's just put political views to one side, but in terms of diversity, how exciting is this for you?
Well, look, there's no doubt that it says something good about Britain, that it has elected its first non-white Prime Minister from a non-Christian background and so on. And of course, I applaud that. But this kind of representation, if you like, is necessary but not sufficient. What I don't want to hear from the new government, as I've been hearing for the last 12 years, is that there are good migrants and bad migrants, that we should be ripping up the Human Rights Act, revising the Refugee Convention. We heard your previous speaker talk about international markets. Well, I want to talk about international human rights and the rule of law. That means that we honour those treaties that we signed with other democracies in the post-war era. And that's what I want to hear from Prime Minister Sunak, who says that he's about unity. And that has to not just be unity in the Conservative Party, that needs to be unity in the country as a whole.
But he has made his views clear, has he not, about the Rwanda policy?
Well, the Rwanda policy is just one strand of it, and I personally think it's a shameful policy. I mean, a lot of people in Britain think that Winston Churchill was the greatest Briton, and he, of course, was a great champion of things like the Refugee Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights. But the Dunkirk spirit was supposed to be about saving people in little boats, not sticking them on planes and transporting them to Rwanda.
When you look at the economic mountain he's got to try and navigate this country up through and over. How difficult do you think it is going to be for him in terms of what will seem to many as austerity again?
Well, it's going to be very difficult indeed, particularly, and I have to be honest about this, he will be associated with some very, very wealthy people. Now, I'm not going to judge him for his privilege, but I am going to judge him for his actions. If he, as a very, very wealthy multi-millionaire from a very wealthy family, asks the poorest people in our society, people going to food banks, to tighten their belts, whilst not requiring the same sacrifices of the super wealthy, I think there's going to be a concern. And of course, people will say, where's the mandate? It really is time for a general election. But what I don't want to happen is for him to somehow placate the far right in his own party, who will want more and more tax cuts, by a culture war about, for example, migrants like his parents were and my parents were, and about trashing the Human Rights Act.
OK, Baroness Chakrabarti, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on BBC News.
Thank you.
Right, let's talk now to Jasmine Cameron-Chilesh. She is a political correspondent with the Financial Times, and she joins us here live in Downing Street. Busy afternoon?
Quite.
So what are you hearing in terms of what he might be able to do in bringing together a government of all the talents and trying to keep all these warring factions on side?
I mean, that will be a priority for Rishi Sunak's new administration. One of the key concerns that many MPs had about Liz Truss is actually that she filled her cabinet with loyalists, and there wasn't really much consideration as to those at the left of the party, the One Nation Conservatives. I think Rishi Sunak will really try to get the balance right between those MPs who supported him and back his vision for the country, but also extending an olive branch to those MPs who were supportive of Liz Truss, say people like Nadhim Zahawi could stay in cabinet. So I think his focus will be on creating a unified cabinet that represents the diversity of the backbenchers at the moment.
But all the old wounds still exist, don't they? He is seen by many of Boris Johnson's supporters as the man who knifed Boris. They will never forgive him. A lot of Tory members will take the same view as well. He's got a lot to prove and a lot of bridges to build, hasn't he?
Yeah, certainly. And in some ways, the shadow of Boris Johnson is still very much looming over the party. You have a lot of his supporters, some of whom are calling for a general election, some of whom are questioning Rishi Sunak's mandate. So he really does have to work hard to essentially prove his worth to the party and prove that actually he is the right man for the job at this time.
What are you hearing about cabinet and cabinet selection?
Well, at the moment, a lot is in flux. Downing Street have confirmed today that we're not expecting to see a transition of power today. Maybe it will be Tuesday, most likely before PMQs. We're not too sure. But obviously, talks are ongoing at the moment. There will be a lot of people who are vying for positions, who are trying to get themselves in cabinet, but all is in flux at the moment.
OK, but of course, a few months ago, Rishi Sunak was talking about some opportunity, perhaps, there's some tax cuts leading up to the 2024-25 election because of the fiscal headroom. Yeah. And that's all gone, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the economic landscape has transformed in the past 2 or 3 weeks, and I think his priority will really be to reassure the financial markets that actually, despite the level of flux that we've had in the past few weeks, that the UK is, balancing its books, the UK is an economically viable country. And I think that will be his priority, as opposed to introducing tax cuts that he promised in the leadership campaign.
How long has he got, do you think, to actually do this unity building programme at the moment? Because, I mean, what is very remarkable today is that we haven't got anyone really coming to the microphones and saying, I disagree fundamentally with this. Now, this is a honeymoon period, but how long is that honeymoon period expected to last?
Oh, well, we know with Liz Truss, she didn't really get that much of one. I mean, Rishi Sunak did address backbenchers in the 1922 committee earlier this afternoon, and the reception was positive. I think there is a genuine sense of relief that we haven't had a protracted leadership race that's lasted the whole week. And actually, there is a general feeling that all wings of the party do need to get back together. In terms of how long his honeymoon period will be, I mean, I think people want to see what Chancellor Jeremy Hunt produces in the physical statement we're expecting.
So we think that Jeremy Hunt will carry on to do that for October the 31st, for Halloween?
I can imagine so, because if you are Rishi Sunak and you're trying to give the impression of stability, you wouldn't want to have another Chancellor during this period. You would want that element of continuity. And so I think a lot of MPs are going to wait to see what the physical statement holds and then publicly come out if there are any issues. But I think they're going to give them some time.
What's your headline for tomorrow?
Probably be focusing on the market reaction and what the city is thinking about our new PM.
OK, which has been Positive?
Yeah, positive for now.
All right, Jasmine, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Right, let's go back to Helen Catt, who joins us from the central lobby there. Have you been hoovering up more reaction there? Has it been, by and large, positive, Helen, on and off the record?
Yeah, it has been, by and large, pretty optimistic, pretty positive, pretty calm. Now, we have spoken to a lot of people who've backed Rishi Sunak throughout this process, but I have someone with me who didn't, who was minded to go for Boris Johnson. Jonathan Gullis, Education Minister, MP for Stoke-on-Trent North. You wanted Boris Johnson as Prime Minister again. Will you now swing wholeheartedly behind Rishi Sunak?
After Boris Johnson made the decision to no longer continue with the process, a selfless act because he put his country and his party before himself, I was very grateful to receive a phone call from Rishi Sunak last night. We had a good conversation, talking about how we can bring the party together, all wings of the Conservative Party being represented in government, and I was happy to be able to tell him on the phone last night that I gave him my support, and I emailed Mel Stride that I was happy to nominate him to become leader of the Conservative Party.
And do you think that is going to be widespread among your colleagues? We've heard, people like Nadine Dorries this morning, Christopher Chope saying he hasn't got a mandate, there should be a general election.
I think what's most important is that we get through these winter months as united as possible in Parliament, because the country are facing real pressures both on their household bills, food bills, the fuel that they put in their car. Those are things that are worrying people, on top of the threat of a nuclear warfare being used by Vladimir Putin with his illegal and immoral war of Ukraine. So I think that we have to make sure we put the country first. That's what I'm hearing from colleagues. I think you've seen a lot of calmness today, a lot of stability, a lot of reassurances that now what we need to do is stop looking inward and start looking outwardly and make sure we deliver for the people of this country.
What are your constituents saying to you? You won your constituency in 2019. It's one of those that we call the Red Wall. What are they saying to you?
What they're saying to me is they want to see a government that's focused on the big issues of the day. They have heard the energy price cap, but I don't think we've sold enough just how massive an intervention that is for these next 6 months. The 37 billion actually that the new Prime Minister, the incoming Prime Minister-elect, if there is such a term, obviously gave out, which is £400 every household, as well as £150 to A to D properties, which 94% of properties in Stoke-on-Trent are. But they also know that it was Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak who gave Stoke-on-Trent the £56 million from the Levelling Up Fund, and actually Rishi Sunak was really important in accelerating the funding for Kidsgrove Sports Centre, which means we could reopen a beating heart of our community, something that Labour closed because they couldn't be bothered to spend £1 to save it. So this is what they will be talking about, is what we're seeing and doing on the ground, and I have every confidence that Rishi Sunak has my constituents' interests at heart.
And do you think he can win their vote, crucially?
Look, it's going to be very tough. The party's been through a turbulent time and no one's denying that. But I think what you'll see from Rishi is calmness, and he's going to have a government of all the talents. When we get through these winter months, these are going to be very hard months, no one's denying that, and there's going to be some very tough decisions made. But I think as we get into the spring of next year, we start to see the green shoots of recovery in the economy, because this is a global situation, not unique to our United Kingdom. Let's not forget inflation in Holland's at 17%. So I think that when we start to turn that corner and we're getting on with other things than just protecting the country, most importantly at these difficult times, then they'll see the all-round vision of the Conservative Party, that 2019 manifesto that we were overwhelmingly elected on, and will deliver for those people and give them a reason why they can continue to lend their vote to the Conservative Party.
And we're talking about Rishi Sunak probably getting a bit of a honeymoon period. To be fair, Liz Truss didn't get a honeymoon period. Rishi Sunak, they're thinking maybe will. How long do you think it will last? Do you think that's it? It's everything's stabilised now. It's going to be business and stability from now on in for the Conservative Party?
I think the fact that you saw over half the parliamentary party nominate Rishi Sunak shows very clearly that we all want calmness. We don't want to keep coming back here and having rounds and rounds of voting and discussions of who should be leader, who shouldn't be. That's not what the country's interested in. It's certainly not what I got into politics for. I got elected in Stoke-on-Trent North Kidsgrove and Talk to deliver, and I've been doing that so far today, as I say, with the other 56 million Levelling Up Fund, 17.6 million Kidsgrove Town deal, 500 brand new Home Office jobs, 1,700 jobs up to at Chatham Valley West. This is the type of things that I've been working hard on the ground. 31 million to Bus Back Better. That's what I want to talk to my constituents about. That's what they want to see from this compassionate government, Conservative government, because the Labour Party for 70 years were in charge in Stoke-on-Trent, and they had no ambition, no plan, no aspiration. They just expected people to be voting fodder. And again, they're looking at the opinion polls and arrogantly expecting that to be the same way again, which I think is something they're going to come unstuck over at the next set of general elections.
Jonathan Gullis, thank you very much. I'll let you go because I need to get on.
You're very kind, thank you.
Okay, so do you hear there? There's a promise of unity, a promise of sticking behind Rishi Sunak as the new Conservative leader and soon, of course, to be the new Prime Minister.
Helen, more from you later on. Thank you very much indeed. I think we can speak now to Sir Anthony Selden. Yes, we can. The political biographer who has written about every Prime Minister since Margaret Thatcher. He joins me now from Windsor. Thank you for joining us, Sir Anthony. Meticulously researched biographies of previous Prime Ministers. I'm not sure if you started on the Liz Truss one yet, but perhaps that won't take quite so long. Let's just look at Rishi Sunak, though, and the electoral mandate that he has for being in power now. Of course, Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair, but do you think that is going to be a problem, a real problem, throughout the rest of this Parliament until he calls a general election?
Yeah, of course it's a problem. Every Prime Minister wants and needs their own mandate to win that at a general election, and that isn't on offer. So he's just going to have to let that go and to do his best with what he's got. But it's really tough taking over after a long period of single party dominance. The Conservatives came into power in 2010 with austerity. They're going to be coming up to the next general election bookended with austerity also. No party has won 5 general elections on the trot since the birth of modern democracy in 1832. It's going to be stupendously difficult.
Fair to say that he's not a charismatic orator. His speech just now, very, very short, without going into very much detail. But in terms of his technical abilities, his city background, his understanding of the markets, and his reassuring presence, it seems, certainly at the moment anyway, if you can judge by that from the market reaction to this news, is that really what any government needs in a period of turmoil like this?
It's absolutely what is needed at the moment. We are in a desperate crisis. I think it's the biggest political crisis since 1963, when the long-serving Prime Minister Harold Macmillan went. Alex Douglas-Home took over. The party was divided. It was burnt out after 12 years in power, exactly like we've had now. But the economic crisis, the economic trough, combining with the political trough, is what I think makes this such a difficult inheritance. But he at least has the respect of the markets. He understands finance. He's shown that he can be compassionate with Eat Out scheme and with furlough, but he can also show that he's tough. Unlike either Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, he's got a far acuter and subtler reading of the markets and of finance than they have, and the markets know it. And that's exactly what we need. It's necessary that there's stabilisation, but it's not sufficient to either have an effective government or indeed for the Tories to win the upcoming general election. So he has some of those skills.
I suppose also, I mean, just looking at diversity, the Tory party, the first party to have 3 female prime ministers. Now we have a man who is a non-practicing Christian. Of course, he's a Hindu. Is that an important plank, do you think, for the government as well? Look, that anyone can come through to this most influential position in the land from what is still a minority. I think the Asian population, 7.5%, 8% at the moment.
So I think that's important, and that's making a valid statement about modern Britain, and indeed about the Conservative Party with its very diverse cabinet and senior positions it had under Boris Johnson. But I don't think that's going to really add an iota to the competence. What will have to be seen now is extreme competence, keeping Jeremy Hunt where he is, really bringing in all the talent, not having a tribal cabinet like Liz Truss had one of her several mistakes, and trying to get as much done as possible before the upcoming general election, because if it isn't, if it is a really acute winter of discontent with many matters really beyond, as always happens with prime ministers, we think that they're terribly powerful, but they're not. They're unseated by events outside their control, epidemics, as with COVID, foreign wars, as in Ukraine, fuel prices or oil prices impacting and destabilizing governments, it's going to be perilously hard for the government. And if it is a very bitter winter, because of the mistakes that have now been made, the government will be blamed, I think, for things, whether or not it's within their capability to have done much about it. And that could put pressure on, if there's a real crisis in confidence in this government, if it doesn't show itself to be really competent, pressure for a general election next spring. I wouldn't rule that out yet.
I mean, you know far better than all of us, but even if things were to go well in the short to mid-term for Rishi Sunak, it's fair to say, isn't it, that modern history shows that parties are punished for a bad mishandling, especially of economic decisions, even if things pick up in the short to medium term. I'm just thinking back to the 90s, for example, and Black Wednesday.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's so similar in so many ways. Black Wednesday in 1992, the Prime Minister, John Major, never recovered the initiative. He battled on for 5 years against, admittedly, a much more formidable Labour leader in Tony Blair. Labour have had two formidable leaders of the opposition, Harold Wilson, then Tony Blair. Keir Starmer isn't of that same league, but in a way he doesn't need to be, because the Conservatives are so divided and are blamed for this crisis, regardless of whether it's their fault or not. So it will be extraordinarily difficult, first of all, to really unite the party, despite what we've been hearing there. There are still deep divisions. Boris Johnson will remain the king over the water. Don't for 1 second think that he won't be showing us some leg, or showing backbenchers and ministers a bit of his leg about how I would do it differently the moment that Rishi Sunak and his cabinet start getting into trouble. That's going to be a constant destabilising factor on top of everything else. So it will be tough, but he has shown that as Chancellor, at least he has that job. But let me just finish by saying, nothing prepares you for being Prime Minister. As Chancellor, he was quite focused on economic and financial policy, unlike, say, Gordon Brown and other Chancellors like George Osborne. He wasn't a broad-thinking person. He's going to need to scale up and do something that Boris Johnson never did, which is truly trust his cabinet ministers. And he needs to have he needs to get morale back into the civil service after that has been trashed and criticised by 3 successive prime ministers. He also needs to get a really effective deputy prime minister to hold the cabinet committee system all together. So if he does all those things, he stands the optimal chance of making a success of his premiership, the 57th varieties of prime minister in Britain.
OK, Sir Anthony Selden, good to speak to you. Thank you very much. Well, the Conservative Party chairman, Jake Berry, called for an end to Tory infighting, saying now is the time for the whole party to come together and unite foursquare behind Rishi as he gets on with the vital work of tackling the challenges we face as a country. Our political editor, Chris Mason, has been getting some reaction from one cabinet member who backed Boris Johnson for the leadership.
Let me introduce James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. Afternoon to you. Your reaction, Rishi Sunak to be our next Prime Minister?
Well, look, I think what we have all wanted is for the government to be relentlessly focused on the domestic and the international issues that confront us all. Stability, focus on good government, these are absolutely the right things. And now that we know we have got some certainty, I think it's a very positive move. I think even another week's worth of delay would have been counterproductive. So I'm very, very pleased that we will now be able to focus on the things that matter, which is working for the British people.
Help me out here, because this time yesterday you were supporting Boris Johnson. You didn't want Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, did you?
Well, Boris decided not to stand. What I've always said is that the job of Prime Minister needs experience. Remember, I had suggested back in the summer that I felt that Boris Johnson should stay. He chose not to run. Rishi is the candidate was the candidate with the most experience. He's he's a talented guy, and I have no doubt that he will build a team that now focus on what we should always be focused on, which is the British people.
What do you say to our viewer who has looked in on what's happened in the last few weeks and comes to the reasonable-minded conclusion that it's been a complete shambles?
Well, no one would want to see what we've seen over the last few months. It's been difficult, it's been painful. I've been dealing with my international counterparts with all the challenges going on around the globe. And of course, what they want is they want the UK government, they want Britain to once again be the rock of stability.
Because they've been laughing at us, haven't they? I mean, overseas we've become a laughingstock.
Well, look, what's going on? I mean, no one's going to defend what's gone on over the last few months. It's been painful, it's been brutal, but now it comes to an end. We focus on the British people, we focus on delivering good government, we focus on supporting our friends in Ukraine and the other global issues that I have to deal with day in, day out. That's what we want to be doing.
And can you convince us right now, here and now, Tory psychodrama is over, you're actually going to focus on governing the country, all this fighting like rats in a sack is done and dusted?
Well, there is no point in refighting the arguments of the summer. The only thing now, in the minds of my Conservative parliamentary colleagues, should be supporting the Prime Minister, supporting the government, supporting the British people, supporting our friends internationally. That should be the only thing that we think about.
A couple of final thoughts. What about the argument that you hear from the opposition parties? Yes, I know opposition parties always call for a general election, but they will make the argument, look, people who voted Conservative back in 2019 did so with Boris Johnson on the ticket, if you like. Now, they've not only got his successor, they've got his successor's successor. And there's a legitimacy question there, isn't there? Who elected this guy who's about to become Prime Minister?
Well, the job of the Prime Minister, in order to remain in office, is to be able to enjoy the confidence of the parliamentary party. Rishi has shown through the numbers today that he has the overwhelming support of the parliamentary party. And of course, opposition parties want to call for a general election, and if they want to put in for a vote of no confidence, they absolutely have the right to do so. What the British people, I think, want, and what they certainly deserve, is a government delivery focused on them, delivering for the British people, and that's what we're going to do.
One reflection for you, if I may, or from you, if I may, Mr. Cleverly, about this is a moment in history, a first person of colour becoming British Prime Minister, which is quite a moment.
Well, ethnic diversity in high office within the Conservative Party is nothing new. But the fact of the matter is, this is the first time for Prime Minister. I am pleased, but frankly unsurprised, that it's happened with Conservatives, because we have always been the party of meritocracy, hard work. Rishi's an incredibly hard-working and smart guy. So, as I say, very, very pleased, but genuinely, that's not the thing that leaps into the forefront of my mind, because we've got work to do.
James Cleverly speaking to our political editor Chris Mason. So there we are, just coming up to 6 o'clock, another extraordinary, tumultuous day in British politics here. Rishi Sunak becomes, or will become officially probably tomorrow when he meets King Charles, the 57th Prime Minister of this country, the first not to be a practising Christian, the first non-white. He is a practising Hindu. He's 42 years old. He bid for the leadership before and he lost out to Liz Truss. This time he was up against Penny Mordaunt, and then a few hours ago, as I think it was a Spectator headline put it, Penny dropped and Rishi got through. So rather like Theresa May, he has been crowned leader of the Tory party, and we understand that probably tomorrow he will travel with Liz Truss, his predecessor, to King Charles to take over officially, as I say, of the 57th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Hugh is up with the 6 o'clock news in a couple of minutes' time. Before that, some weather with Stav.
Hello there. It's been a pretty quiet start to the new week, and indeed as we head into tomorrow there should be a lot of dry, settled weather with some sunshine. As we move deeper into this week, things are set to turn even milder with our air source coming up from the south. It will at times bring some rain, which could be quite heavy, and strong winds, particularly across the north and the west of the UK. Tonight it looks like winds won't be too much of a feature. There'll be further showers across northern and western areas, drier the further east that you are, nowhere particularly cold. with lows of 7 to 11 Celsius. Here's the pressure chart then for Tuesday. We've got a big area of low pressure sitting out in the Atlantic. This feature running around it will start to push into the southwest of the country later in the day to bring some rain and strong winds. But ahead of that, you can see much of Tuesday, a fine day to come for many. A lot of dry weather, some sunshine, 1 or 2 showers dotted around here and there, but most places will be dry, but it will be turning wet and windy later in the day across the southwest quadrant. But ahead of it, it'll be very mild, temperatures reaching highs of 18 degrees in the east.